The Chinese military is one of the largest militaries on planet Earth, spending an incredible $293 billion in 2021 on defense. They rank second in the world, behind the United States. Coming in second here is impressive enough. If you know anything about Uncle Sam, then you know they won't be outspent when it comes to the military. The Chinese military is officially known as the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and it consists of 5 service branches: the Ground Force or Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Rocket Force, which handles all kinds of ballistic, nuclear, and other missiles, and the Strategic Support Force, which deals with space, cyber, electronic, and political warfare. Highly trained, motivated, and armed with an arsenal of deadly weapons, they are truly a formidable fighting force. However, as the world saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, having a massive army and all the shiny weapons you can ask for doesn't guarantee success. So how does the PLA stack up against the rest of the world? What does history tell us about their level of preparedness, and how would they fare if a real war were to break out? Before we delve deeper into the current capabilities and strategies of the PLA, it's essential to take a step back in time. How did the PLA evolve into the formidable force we see today, and what historical events shaped its development? The journey begins with the PLA's inception on August 1, 1927, during the Nanchang Uprising, a landmark moment that ignited the Chinese Civil War. It was in the crucible of this war and the subsequent conflicts that followed where the PLA honed its skills and strategies. Throughout the 1930s, the Communist PLA and the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek clashed across China in a brutal struggle, a conflict that resulted in millions of casualties. Understanding this tumultuous history is key to comprehending the PLA's current form and function. One of the most pivotal events was known as the Long March, when the Communist forces primarily commanded by Mao Zedong found themselves in a difficult position, facing certain encirclement and defeat. Mao took his forces on a 5,600-mile march across China to another communist stronghold. A fraction of his forces survived the march, but it cemented Mao as a living legend among the Chinese. His leadership and bravery gave the PLA the motivation they needed to stay in the fight. In 1937, however, hostilities were mostly put on hold when Imperial Japan invaded China. The two sides officially formed the Second United Front and decided to deal with the most apparent threat, the Japanese, before resuming the fraternal bloodshed. During World War II, the PLA played a pivotal role in the Allied resistance against Japan. They had very few technological advantages, very few armored units, poor weaponry, and no real training, but they persisted nonetheless. Chinese resistance would continually infuriate and demoralize the Japanese invaders. They employed a wide range of guerrilla tactics and were an extremely useful ally of the United States and British forces. Once World War II ended in 1945, the PLA and Kuomintang went right back to killing each other. The second phase of the Chinese Civil War ran from 1945 until 1949, and again resulted in millions of casualties and untold levels of destruction. The PLA proved they had what it took to win, however, as they won the hearts and minds of the Chinese people and proved far more capable and competent at governing than their nationalist brethren. Finally, in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists suffered defeat after defeat, lost control over the country, and retreated to Taiwan. Even though they did not admit defeat, the war was over. Mao, the Communist Party, and the PLA had won, and their victory was the cornerstone in establishing the People's Republic of China. The celebrations were short-lived, however, as China joined the Cold War on the side of the Soviet Union. The skyrocketing tensions eventually erupted into incredible levels of violence again, this time against the United States and its allies. China joined the rapidly escalating Korean War on October 19, 1950, when the PLA crossed the Yalu River to support their North Korean allies. It was this force that was temporarily renamed the People's Volunteer Army. The logic being that using the word volunteer was implying a less aggressive stance on behalf of the Chinese government, meaning that the troops were there as volunteers out of a sense of duty to their Korean comrades. Not sure the rebranding made a difference to the men on the ground, whichever side they fought for. Once the Chinese forces crossed the Yalu, they swept through North Korea, pushing back UN and US forces until it came to a head at a place called Chosin Reservoir. This battle is infamous for its ferocity, horrendous weather conditions, as well as the overall resilience and bravery of the men who fought there. With temperatures dropping to as low as -38 Fahrenheit, frostbite was rampant and many men were pushed to their breaking point. The Chinese forces here had a variety of weapons and equipment. Some were left over from the Japanese and Kuomintang troops, while others were scavenged from fallen Americans or provided by their Soviet allies. This lack of continuity presented an interesting logistical challenge for their supply lines, but the PLA persisted nonetheless. Most of their weapons were small arms such as rifles, submachine guns, light machine guns, grenades, and mortars. The PLA did not have much in the way of heavy weapons such as artillery or air support, and what they did have usually came from the Soviets. The greatest resource the PLA had at this point was its manpower. During the battle, they employed rapid flanking and infiltration tactics aimed at maximizing their numerical advantage, similar to what the Soviets did during World War II. The thinking was that if you threw enough men at a numerically inferior position, eventually they would overwhelm it, or the Americans would run out of ammunition and be surrounded. Accounts from the battle describe seeing wave after wave of Chinese troops attacking US and UN positions with grim determination to fight for every foot of ground. These tactics saw success, but were always accompanied by staggering casualty rates. Battling against the enemy as well as the elements, the Chinese troops and their North Korean allies eventually captured a large part of the battlefield. However, they paid for it with a tremendous amount of blood, with the true winner of the battle still being debated today. Chosin had proven to the PLA, as well as the world, that the Chinese military was not a backwater force of ill-equipped peasants. While they may not have had the best equipment, they used what they had to deadly effect. One thing was clear: the PLA was becoming a modern military force capable of taking on the UN and the United States. The Chinese-Soviet relationship meant that the PLA would continue to receive weapons, training, and guidance from their Russian counterparts as the Cold War escalated. After the Korean War, the PLA continued its march toward modernization through a series of smaller conflicts and proxy wars. With the death of the Communist Party leader Mao Zedong in 1976, China began even more campaigns to modernize the PLA and level the playing field with the rest of the world. From 1975 to today, the PLA has undergone a tremendous change and has become one of the world's most formidable militaries, at least on paper. The two most recent examples of the PLA's combat experience illustrate how far they have come and how far they have to go. Since 1975, these two examples are the only times the PLA has seen legitimate combat, and what happened in each speaks volumes about where the PLA stands today. In 1979, China and Vietnam fought a war now known as the Sino-Vietnamese War. This dispute between neighbors started as a response to Vietnam's invasion and occupation of their neighbor Cambodia. Vietnam set out to put an end to the particularly murderous and Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge regime. The Khmer Rouge had been in power since their victory over the Cambodian government in 1975. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge conducted widespread genocide on the Cambodian people. When the dust settled, between 1.5 to 3 million people had been murdered, which at this time was a quarter of the Cambodian population. Vietnam did not like what was going on across their western border and liked it even less when the Khmer Rouge soldiers attacked across the Vietnamese border repeatedly. This back and forth went on for a few years, but it exploded on Christmas Day, December 25, 1978, when Vietnam decided to invade Cambodia. Vietnamese forces overthrew the Khmer Rouge government in just 2 weeks and installed their own puppet government. Seeing as the Khmer Rouge had been backed by the Chinese government was very angry and vowed to retaliate. This retaliation started on February 17, 1979, and lasted for about a month. PLA forces overran the northern Vietnamese border and gained large amounts of territory quickly. The northern part of Vietnam saw heavy fighting and tremendous casualties on both sides. Most of the fighting took place in the provinces of Cao Bang, Lao Cai, and Lang Son. The Vietnamese tried to avoid direct confrontations, instead opting for what had been their bread and butter for decades, guerrilla warfare. The PLA force that they faced had not seen real combat since the early 1950s, and was a little rusty. The weapons and vehicles they used were outdated or not up to the task. Their soldiers were mostly untested and green. The Vietnamese, on the other hand, had been fighting continually since World War II and had mostly modern weapons. The fighting raged until March 16, 1979, with both sides claiming victory. China claimed it had won a victory and had opened the road to Hanoi, basically saying that they could have taken the capital, but they just didn't want to. The Vietnamese forces remained as an occupying force in Cambodia and claimed that they had won by repelling the PLA forces and forcing them to withdraw. With thousands upon thousands dead and nothing really gained by either side, things returned to normal and nothing had really changed. For the PLA, although not much had been gained, they realized quickly that to be a competitive military in a fast-paced world, they needed to up their game and continually improve. This served as a wake-up call and ego check. From the end of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979 all the way until 2016, the PLA had a few engagements, but nothing of substance. The next time they saw significant combat came in 2016, when they were part of a UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. This conflict was the first test of the PLA's combat capabilities for the first time in 4 decades, and served as an indication of the combat readiness and effectiveness of the PLA. China committed combat troops to the UN for the first time in 2015, a major divergence from their long-held stance of no foreign intervention. Since 2000, China had steadily increased their military aid to the UN, and in early 2015 sent 700 combat soldiers to South Sudan. The Chinese government did not undertake this mission simply out of the goodness of their heart, however, as the Chinese government has significant financial interests in Sudanese petroleum. Say what you will, but I challenge you to find any government that does things solely to help people and not for some ulterior motive. Glass houses, folks, glass houses. In 2016, the peacekeeping soldiers of the PLA were responsible for the security of a large section of the South Sudanese capital of Juba. Due to decades of rampant violence, there were over 37,000 displaced civilians in and around the capital. The Chinese soldiers here were tasked with protecting these civilians in official UN camps. The camps themselves had very little in terms of protection against an assault by combat-hardened troops backed by artillery and tanks. These camps were more refugee camps than they were military redoubts, and that mistake would be costly. Protected mainly by barbed wire fences, sand-filled HESCO boxes, wooden guard towers, and chain-link fences, the Chinese UN troops were not in a good situation. To make matters worse, 2 different and warring armies were converging on Juba. One army had the current president at the helm, and the other army was commanded by the former vice president. In terms of strength estimates, no one is sure of the number of government troops present, but the generally accepted number of rebel troops was around 1,400. On July 8th, both armies attacked the city and the UN-run camps. To no one's surprise, the 2 armies observed no rules of engagement and attacked everyone they came across. A widespread campaign of looting and violence commenced, with the civilians stuck in the crossfire, looking to the UN soldiers to do the exact thing that they were there to do and what they are named for: keep the peace. The Chinese peacekeepers were completely outgunned, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. They fought as best as they could, but only really had light squad-level weapons and a handful of armored troop carriers. As a result, the Chinese troops were forced to retreat further into the camps and set up a last stand. The civilians caught up in this madness were brutally killed, tortured, and forced to endure other unspeakable horrors. In addition to this, a UN aid warehouse was raided and emptied of its food and medical supplies. This aid was being directly used to help the refugees of war and was estimated to be worth a total of $30 million and enough food to help 200,000 people for over a month. The Chinese soldiers did the best they could, fighting back against a superior force. They did successfully deter assaults into the heart of the camps and help defend the 9,000 civilians sheltering there. After 3 days of fighting, countless civilians, militiamen, and 2 Chinese soldiers were dead. The Chinese soldiers died when a rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, hit an armored troop carrier near them. The troop carrier's armor is designed more for deflecting landmines than stopping high-explosive rockets. In the immediate aftermath, all anyone cared about was who to point the finger at for this catastrophic failure of the UN's mission. The UN released several scathing reports claiming that the Chinese soldiers had failed to follow orders, abandoned their posts, and ultimately contributed to the failure. One analyst even went as far as to claim that Chinese soldiers are risk-averse and aren't willing to take the aggressive action necessary to win the fight. The Chinese government obviously refuted these claims, stating that the UN rules of engagement and subsequent policies regarding combat severely limited the soldiers in what they could actually achieve and the equipment they could use. They claimed that the UN kept the soldiers in a defensive posture that put them at a disadvantage. What they are saying is that the Chinese peacekeepers were not put into a position to be successful. There was also a high level of confusion here, as there was no centralized command. Chinese troops received sometimes conflicting orders from multiple officers, often from different nations. As with most arguments, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Before this, the PLA had not seen real combat since 1979, which means that any officers with combat experience would be well into their 60s. not ideal. Training is great but can only go so far. No one knows how they will react when live rounds are flying too close for comfort, so it should not surprise anyone that the Chinese troops here tried their best but simply did not have enough field experience to make a difference. It also didn't help that they were outnumbered and outgunned. If they had their own equipment and vehicles, would it have changed the outcome? We can only speculate. Either way, it was an unmitigated disaster. What happened here was like if the Yankees played a single A team and got blown out by 10 runs. So while this battle makes the PLA's lack of real combat experience at every level glaringly apparent, it's also a critical failure on the part of the UN to adequately arm and prepare these men for the reality of the situation. Where does the PLA stand today? As of the production of this video, the PLA has about 2 million active duty troops with another 500,000 in reserve. Of those 2 million active duty troops, around 700,000 of them are conscripts, which isn't ideal for morale. Those conscripts go out to serve on 2-year enlistments. As discussed earlier, these troops are spread out across the 5 branches of the service, as well as with various auxiliary and police units. The PLA has a variety of weapons at its disposal. The main infantry rifles issued to its troops are the QBZ-95 and QBZ-191, which fire a 5.8 x 42mm round. In terms of sidearms, they utilize the OSZ-92, which fires a 5.8 x 21mm DAP-92. For a bit of a bigger bang, they have the PF-89 unguided anti-tank rocket launcher. For heavy weapons, the PLA boasts a large contingent of armor that theoretically rivals its Western counterparts. The ZTZ-99A main battle tank and ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle are great examples of this. While they've not seen combat directly, they have all the tools necessary to be deadly. The Navy of the PLA is considered one of the most, if not the most powerful Navy in the world, with a battle force of 350 ships. For comparison, the US Navy has around 290 ships in its battle force. In terms of firepower, PLA Navy is extremely formidable as well, even outpacing the US Navy as per a 2016 study. The PLA Air Force is impressive as well, with 400,000 service members and 3,500 aircraft. They boast an arsenal of modern aircraft including the formidable Chengdu J-20. In terms of combat experience, not much has changed since the debacle of 2016. The only PLA officers or enlisted men with actual combat experience would be the ones who are still alive following the Sino-Vietnamese War, or one of the few who were involved in the Battle of Juba in 2016. Either way, not a lot of tried and true combat wisdom can be passed down to the lower ranks, and that's not what you want when you're gearing up for war. The best the PLA can do is train as realistically as possible. So that being said, what kind of training do they receive? All members of the PLA when they initially enlist are taken through basic training, similar to almost all other militaries on the planet. After that, they continue to more specialized training. In recent years, the Chinese government and high-ranking PLA officers have acknowledged that the lower ranks, and especially the conscripts, have not been receiving enough adequate training to prepare them for the task ahead. To fix this, they have stagnated conscription cycles so that they can afford to give units more substantial training and get them as prepared as possible for their new roles. As they say, practice makes perfect, and the PLA takes that one to heart. They drill relentlessly every summer, doing large-scale mock combat operations and try to get as close to the real thing as they possibly can. This includes the use of virtual reality systems, which allow the soldiers, sailors, and airmen to train in realistic scenarios without risk of injury. In 2023, the PLA focused on enhancing its integrated combat and rapid response capabilities. This means that they are working on efficient communication and coordination between the different branches of the PLA as they respond to a variety of external threats. Looking toward the future, China will continue to train relentlessly as global tension continues to mount. In regard to its hostile relationship with its neighbor Taiwan, the PLA continues to conduct military exercises and training in preparation for the likely amphibious invasion. It's no secret that China wants Taiwan brought back into the fold, but how they plan to actually achieve that is anyone's guess. While the fallout from this invasion would be an international catastrophe, the results of such a move is not clear. Taiwan is preparing as well and has turned the island into a fortress with hidden aircraft hangars, surface-to-air missiles, and enough machine gun nests to make anyone think twice. The Chinese government and subsequently the PLA have an increasing interest in the resources of Africa. As the market for the resources and the energy produced here become more valuable, it will be more important than ever for Chinese interests to be protected. It's really a question of when more PLA troops will be stationed there, not if. So all in all, the People's Liberation Army looks great on paper. It has everything you can want in a modern military: thorough training, advanced weapons, impressive armor, and ships. The one thing it lacks, that's so crucial to success, is combat experience. None of their enlisted men, except for some who might have been at Juba, have any experience getting shot at. For the officers, the only ones with tangible experience are well past fighting age or unlucky enough to have participated in Juba alongside their men. All the best weapons in the world aren't going to mean a thing if the soldiers using them don't have the experience to use them effectively while under fire. While the PLA could be an incredible fighting force when things heat up, all we can do now is speculate. Until the bullets start flying, there's no telling how they'll perform. So while the world holds its breath watching what will happen between China and Taiwan, the actual combat effectiveness of the PLA is going to be a topic of debate. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know what you thought in the comments as well. Now go and check out why China's military is a paper tiger, or click this other video instead. China has been the world's economic miracle story of the last 50 years. Since the People's Republic began to open its economy to the world in 1978, China has gone from an impoverished backwater to one of the centers of the global economic system. GDP growth has averaged 9.32% over the 44 years since it opened up. China has become the world's second largest economy by nominal GDP and has even surpassed the United States when measured in GDP by purchasing power parity. In sure signs of its economic strength, China managed to avoid recession during both the global financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2021. However, since 2010, when it surpassed Japan to become the world's second largest economy, the trend has been clear. China's rate of economic growth is slowing down. The country grew by only 2.99% in 2022, which is low by its standards. What is going on in China's economy, and what does it mean for that country and the security of the Indo-Pacific region? Since the internal chaos in China ended with Mao's death, the Chinese Communist Party has maintained power on an implicit promise. It would still rule in an authoritarian manner, but in exchange, the people would get the benefit of security and fast economic growth. So far, the party has managed to fulfill this promise. Made in China has practically become an institution in the global economy. The People's Republic has entrenched itself at the heart of the world's supply chain, and not just in cheap manufactured goods either. China dominates the manufacturing process of many of the world's most important supply chains. For example, it holds a near-monopoly position in the rare earth elements that are crucial raw components for the modern digital economy. China controls 50 to 60% of the mining market for these materials and 90% of the intermediate processing stage. China's GDP per capita has risen from $156.4 in 1978 to $12,720 in 2022. However, this period of breakneck, unprecedented economic growth came with hidden costs, and those cracks in the foundation are now beginning to show. One of the most important of these problems is China's looming demographic plunge. Long the world's most populous country, China peaked in population in about 2020 and has now begun a slow decline. UN sources estimate that India surpassed it as the world's most highly populated country in April 2023. By the end of the century, demographers predict that China will have about 776 million people, a little over half of what it has today. This is bad enough for the Chinese economy, but hidden beneath these raw numbers are trends that are arguably worse. China's working population peaked at about 763.5 million in 2014. In 2022, it had shrunk to 733.5 million. The World Bank warned in 2016 that by 2040, China's working-age population could shrink by over 10%. Meanwhile, the elderly are growing as a share of the Chinese population, and it is happening at a rapid rate. In 2015, there were 136.9 million people over the age of 65 in China, which is more than Japan's entire population, and the trend will accelerate. By 2030, China's 65 and over population will be 238.8 million, more than Japan and Egypt's combined total populations. By 2050, China's elderly will be almost 350 million strong, equal to the total combined populations of Japan, Egypt, Australia, and Germany. There is also a comparative lack of younger people in China to support these aging people compared to that seen in other countries. This problem comes as a result of China's one-child policy, which was implemented between 1979 and 2015 as a way to curb the supposed problem of overpopulation. Although the policy was modified to 2 children in 2015 and all limits on childbirth were removed in 2021, the consequences of this policy will be felt for many years to come. For nearly 40 years, the one-child policy limited the growth of the younger cohorts of China's population. The Chinese government has been trying to encourage women to have more children, but in this it's facing another hurdle the one-child policy created for so long. China has a serious shortage of women of childbearing age. Chinese families have long had cultural preferences for sons over daughters. The inability for families to have more than one child meant that female fetuses were preferentially aborted during the years the one-child policy was in place. Infanticide and abandonment of daughters were also widespread in certain areas. One 2015 study found that in some areas where it was common, as many as 1 in 10 baby girls were abandoned in the 1990s. Lucky abandoned girls were adopted by families abroad. Others faced social disadvantages in their adopted family homes. Unlucky ones did not survive. Another 2015 study estimated that there were 62 million missing women in China, women who would be alive today if not for the one-child policy and the preference for male births. Because of the combination of these cultural practices and the draconian one-child policy, millions of Chinese men cannot find wives. In 2021, there were about 30 million more men than women in China, and the gap is widening. Perhaps unsurprisingly, China's fertility rate has fallen to a historic low of 1.23 births per woman. The easing and eventual overturning of the one-child policy has not been enough to stop this trend. Child rearing is also expensive, as raising one child to the age of 18 costs nearly 7 times China's GDP per capita, and China's draconian response to the COVID-19 pandemic ensured that even expecting mothers had limited hospital access, further disincentivizing women from having children. Why are these demographic issues so problematic for China going forward? Because the country has long relied on a young and mobile workforce. Productivity will therefore decrease as this cohort become less of a presence in the overall population. The shortage of workers, especially in the country's all-important manufacturing sector, will lead to increased wages and reduced profitability for the companies involved, making China less of an attractive place to invest. As India's population grows and remains younger than China, companies will likely see it as a more attractive place to allocate capital to, as its workforce proportion will increase in population relative to China. Meanwhile, China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, its draconian zero-COVID policy, with frequent lockdowns that lasted from January 2020 to December 2022, has done more than harm expecting mothers. It's disrupted China's supply chains, further increasing the incentive for foreign investors to park their manufacturing elsewhere. To make matters worse, China's population is aging at an earlier stage of the country's national development than that seen in places like Japan or Europe. China will therefore need to adjust how it cares for its elderly. This is expensive and will require institutional changes, particularly as there are fewer younger working people to care for their elderly relatives, which has been the cultural norm in China up until now. Without institutional support, the growing cost of elder care will even further disincentivize young people from having children, making for an even worse demographic problem in the future. China may need to look at its neighbor Japan for a model on how to take care of an increasingly elderly population. However, China's economy faces shorter-term challenges as well. One of the nagging problems is that its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which was one of the centerpieces announcing China's arrival as a supposed global financial powerhouse, is rapidly becoming a trillion-dollar disaster. In 2013, China began the BRI as a means to expand its influence. By investing in the infrastructure of so many nations on the Eurasian landmass and the African continent, China could reorient world commerce away from the United States and toward routes that converge on Beijing, routes conveniently harder for the American military to reach. However, these investments have not been able to deliver on the ambitions Beijing had for them. Examples of less than optimal results abound, from Kenya's railroad to nowhere, to the financial failure of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, to the scaling back of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. Originally worth $62 billion, CPEC has been subject to corruption, financial setbacks, and terrorist attacks. The project's crown jewel, the port of Gwadar on the Indian Ocean, did not meet the financial expectations that China or Pakistan believed that improvements to the port would afford it. The lack of performance of CPEC has swelled Pakistan's national debt and forced the country to take a $6.3 billion bailout from the IMF. In fact, China's financial practices for its BRI have set the ambitious scheme up for failure. While infrastructure investments from Western countries typically have low interest rates over 30-year periods, China's BRI can have interest rates as high as 7% for half that time span. China also imposes coercive terms in lending the money. It can call in debts at any time, and often prohibits the debtor countries from getting refinancing or being able to restructure their payments. These terms have now had some unexpected consequences for the creditor country. Firstly, the BRI is not meeting its expectations, and the costs involved to the debtor countries have prompted participants to leave. Italy and the Philippines were two of the most important countries to join the BRI, as China's gaining influence within them could have given it some leverage over the US-led alliance system. However, both of them pulled out of the BRI in 2023. As BRI-related projects have often not delivered on their promises, more countries are reassessing or leaving China's infrastructure program. Meanwhile, as the countries that have taken Chinese money often have trouble paying back the funds, those outstanding debts have become a problem for the creditor country. China's BRI began with a lending spree on terms that seemed lopsided in Beijing's favor. Unfortunately for Beijing, when the creditor lends $1 trillion, that creditor is placing itself in a position of vulnerability. By lending so much under such harsh conditions to less than credit-worthy customers and projects, China was taking as big of a gamble as the debtor countries. The numbers bear this out. In 2010, only 5% of China's overseas lending portfolio went to parties that were in financial distress. In 2023, that number is 60%. The end result is that Beijing now has a major problem on its hands in getting the money back. China has needed to issue $240 billion in emergency loans to 22 countries. 80% of those loans came between 2016 and 21. However, those bailouts didn't come cheaply. The debtor countries needed to take a 5% interest rate, over twice that charged by the IMF under similar circumstances. This dynamic raises longer-term questions about the sustainability of Chinese BRI debt and whether China will ever get its money back. The BRI is also slowing down. As countries grow more worried about China's international ambitions, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, they have been more concerned about the security risks of the BRI and hesitant to start new projects under its banner. Although secondary to the worries over security risks, environmental concerns have also been increasing in relation to the BRI, causing additional hesitance. China has attempted to address the environmental concerns. In 2019, the leadership in Beijing pledged to reformat the BRI into an open, clean, and green project. However, there is little indication that environmental contingencies are taking place in existing BRI projects, and China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its wolf warrior diplomacy have further increased skepticism of Beijing's initiative abroad. The United States is also making it more difficult for China to implement the BRI. America's sanctions on Chinese state-owned firms, many of which have been heavily involved in the BRI, increase the hesitance of third-party organizations to work with them. For example, China has already asked for collaborations with third parties in the marketplace to reduce the costs of financing the BRI, attempting to collaborate with France, Italy, and Singapore in the process. However, because of American sanctions on Chinese companies involved in the BRI, these third parties that China is attempting to bring on board are more hesitant to offer assistance, leaving China on the hook and hoping it gets its money back. China's BRI is therefore facing problems, which now threaten to undermine the homeland's economy and contribute to China's own considerable financial problems. As China grew so rapidly, it went on a lending spree at home just as much as it did with the BRI abroad. The lending spree is now creating problems in the Chinese domestic economy. One of these is in the growing debt problems faced by municipalities in China. For example, Wuhan, the largest city in central China and the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, has been forced to call in the loans it extended to hundreds of local entities. According to the city's finance bureau, 259 entities owe it a combined total equivalent to $14 million. These organizations include public and private companies, government departments, and even think tanks. Another consequence of China's zero-COVID policy was to drain the budget of many municipal and provincial governments, adding to the provincial and municipal debt problems. The lockdowns prevented economic activity, while governments were forced to spend large amounts of money on frequent mass testing programs and quarantine centers. To further illustrate the problem, Guangdong province alone spent $22 billion on the zero-COVID policy, while revenues declined sharply. Tax breaks to businesses hit hard by China's zero-COVID policy have also contributed to declining revenues and reduced local government services. Over $524 billion worth of such tax breaks were granted by government entities across China. In total, China could have outstanding government debt over $18 trillion, $10 trillion of which is hidden debt that riskier local government financing agents owe. Some of China's cities have responded by reducing medical spending for the country's growing elderly population, cutting transportation services and lowering fuel subsidies. Chinese municipalities have also been forced to reduce wages paid to government employees. Even wealthier provinces like Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu have forced their workforces to take 30% pay cuts. Overall, in the span between 2016 and 2023, China's government debt grew from a 47% ratio of its GDP to 102%. This ratio is still behind the United States at 122% of GDP, but the debt growth rate in China has been far steeper. China's real estate problems are adding to the problems of government debt and economic weakness. Land sales make up about 40% of the revenues for local governments in China. Unfortunately for them, these have been in decline after a long period of expansion. Between January and October 2022, land sales in China fell by 26% from the same span in 2021. China's real estate developers are losing revenue as well due to collapsing home sales. Data released by China's 100 biggest property developers show that new home sales were 33% lower in July 2023 than they were a year earlier. China's largest property developer, Country Garden, abruptly withdrew from an attempt to raise $300 million in new shares on the news of the decline in home sales. In October 2023, international observers believed that Country Garden had defaulted on its foreign debt payments. International bondholders were reported in Reuters as seeking urgent talks with the company. Country Garden's troubles are far from an isolated case. In 2021, China saw a wave of defaults by major property developers. Evergrande, another of China's behemoth real estate developers, was declared to be in default in December of that year, failing to make $82.5 billion worth of interest payments. Evergrande has since gone into bankruptcy. The Evergrande problems accompanied those of Kaiser, another property developer, which had its shares halted on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange after it became unlikely to meet a $400 million offshore debt deadline. China's real estate market was critical to its rise as an economic powerhouse, making up as much as 30% of its GDP. Overexpansion of the property market, however, has long led investors and foreign observers to point out a bubble in the real estate sector. China's ghost cities have become a frequent item of international attention. There may be as many as 50 of these cities at various stages of development. Originally, these were intended to redistribute some economic opportunities and give rural people somewhere else to go than China's huge coastal cities. However, these developments have often not delivered on their promises to investors. There may be as many as 50 million empty apartments in these developments, which have few or no residents in total, which means they are not returning the capital that was spent in creating them. Chinese authorities have tried to shore up the property market and have at times demonstrated the ability to develop cities from scratch. The Pudong district in Shanghai was once a swamp. Today it has a population of about 5.6 million. The ingredients for success in the top-down developmental approach are availability of jobs and transportation, but it's far from certain if China will be able to translate the success of Pudong to the other ghost cities located further away from China's coastal heartland. China's demographic problems will also present an increasing challenge to the unused property that attracted so much capital during the expansion phase. Less people means less demand for the large amounts of homes and shopping centers that China has accumulated over the years. China's economy has also become less productive because of its increasing politicization. The frequent embedding of Communist Party members in private companies and the authorities favoring state-owned companies over private ones has made domestic investors nervous and foreign investors even more leery about putting their money into Chinese enterprises. China's ability to keep itself at the center of existing supply chains and entrench itself at the center of future supply chains will be put further into question. China has become a colossus in the global economy, but some of the measures it took over the years to ensure its continued growth increasingly look like they have proven short-sighted. With aversion from international investors, sanctions from the United States, and fewer people to make purchases in real property or in consumer goods, China's economic growth will continue to slow down. And with uncertain debt structures both at home and abroad, a Chinese financial crisis seems inevitable. Meanwhile, China's increasing economic weakness could pose even more security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. China has invested much of its wealth into its military buildup, and with economic troubles growing, Beijing might get the impression that it needs to use its military power to remake the order in the region now, when it still has the chance, and the inertia from its period of economic growth is still going. This is why many American military leaders and national security experts worry about an invasion of Taiwan before 2030. The situation, with the growing regional power close to peaking in its influence, resembles that seen in Germany before World War I. But do you think the same? What do you think are some of the challenges facing the Chinese economy as we move into the second quarter of the 21st century? Will China's economic problems add to a short-term security challenge for the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. And make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and get more military analysis from military experts. China has taken a bold step to protect its interests and gain more influence. It has built massive artificial islands, equipped with military installations and defense capabilities. But as the world looked on, China didn't see the big problem coming that would mess up its plan for more power. Here's what happened. China aims to be the world's leading superpower by the year 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in the Civil War and rise to power on the mainland. Unfortunately for Beijing, China's own geography works against it in achieving this goal. China is surrounded by hostile islands that prevent it from projecting power into the world's oceans and threaten to cut off the shipping its economy relies on. To help mitigate this geographical disadvantage, China has attempted to increase its power in the strategically vital South China Sea, seizing control of disputed islands, rocks, and reefs. China has since fortified these areas by creating artificial islands and militarizing them with airfields and hangars, radar stations, anti-aircraft weapons, and ship-killing hardware. The United States and China's neighbors in the region watched this island-building campaign with great alarm, marveling at how quickly China built and militarized its islands. However, these artificial islands aren't all they're cracked up to be. In trying to solve one problem, China only created another. Let's just say that these islands might not have the staying power that China needs them to have if it wants to use them as an effective method of power projection in the first island chain. Let's explore the reasons why China built the islands to begin with, why these islands are now in trouble, and why Beijing's ambitions in the South China Sea might sink, literally. The legal origin of the artificial islands comes from China's infamous 9-line map, which it has used to claim 90% of the waters in the South China Sea. Officially, China justifies this claim and the 9-line with historical anecdotes. For example, China maintains that it and its people had been in the South China Sea since the days of the mythical Jia dynasty that supposedly began in about the year 2070 BC. Naturally, few people believe these assertions. The historical claims were fig leaves to hide a more cynical, self-interested motive. The South China Sea's waters are economically and geostrategically vital. Economically, the South China Sea has about 15% of the world's total fishing potential, 11 billion barrels of oil, and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In 2021, 22% of the world's global trade, valued at about $5.3 trillion, passed through the shipping lanes in this area, including 60% of all maritime trade, 40% of the world's petroleum products, and 1/3 of the world's total shipping. Simply put, whoever controls these waters controls the fates of the countries that rely on this trade. China is one such country. By building its artificial islands and fortifying the area, China can more easily protect its own trade, muscle in on the natural resources in the South China Sea, and exclude the access of other nations, or at least charge them expensive tolls for the use of such resources. Geostrategically, however, the South China Sea is still trapped within the first island chain. To make matters worse for Beijing, these island nations are aligned with China's strategic rival, the United States. Because of the geopolitical alignment, the United States Navy can easily blockade a series of choke points around the South China Sea and disrupt or cut off shipping to the Chinese mainland. The most important of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca. through which China gets a large portion of its energy. In 2016, 16 million barrels of oil and 3.2 million barrels of liquefied natural gas pass through these narrow waters every day, a figure that is likely now higher. China's dependency on the trade that passes through this choke point has been called its Malacca dilemma, and Beijing has often used this supposed vulnerability as an excuse for its territorial expansion in the area. By building and militarizing islands, China can theoretically bring more ships, aircraft, and missiles closer to the Strait of Malacca and other hotspots, giving it more leverage over the choke points and making it more costly for the United States Navy to project power into the first island chain. To make a long story short, China wants to seize control of the rocks and reefs in the South China Sea to promote its own self-interest at the expense of other nations like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, on whose exclusive economic zones Beijing has encroached. A 2016 ruling against Beijing by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which completely invalidated the Nine-Dash Line as a legitimate territorial claim, was simply ignored. As is often the case in international relations, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. China had expanded its reach into the South China Sea through military means since the 1970s, when it seized control of the Paracel Islands from Vietnam. However, China began its modern campaign in the South China Sea when it seized control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. The following year, China started to expand much further. It began building artificial islands in the Spratlys, creating 3,200 new acres of land, militarizing the islands as the years went by. In total, China has 28 outposts in the waters of its supposed Nine-Dash Line map. 20 of these outposts are in the Paracel Islands, an additional 7 are in the Spratlys, and it also has the Scarborough Shoal. The artificial island building campaign centered mostly on the Spratlys. Artificial islands are created by dredging and shifting material from the reefs and seafloor beneath them. Rocks and sand must be pulverized in this process, and naturally, the creation of artificial islands was destructive to the wildlife in the area. Mounds of material needed to be pulverized and moved in the process. The American Admiral Harry Harris, who was commander of the United States Pacific Fleet at the time these constructions were taking place, called these artificial islands China's Great Wall of Sand, in a speech delivered to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in March 2015. According to an analysis by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, China has reclaimed a total of 13.5 square kilometers of land across the 7 reefs it has used in its island-building campaign. China's island-building vessels can dredge up material at impressive rates. Just one of them, the Tianjing Hao, operated by CCCC Tianjing Dredging, can deploy a cutter with the power of 4,200 kilowatts to the seabed. Material is then moved through a pipeline ashore for land reclamation purposes or onto a barge. The Tianjing Hao can deploy its cutter to a depth of 30 meters and extract 4,500 cubic meters of material per hour. Between February and March 2014, this ship was spotted conducting dredging operations in Johnson Reef in the Spratly Islands. This area has now been occupied by China, and the reef has since been militarized. Although Johnson Reef is too small to host aircraft, it is armed with anti-aircraft guns and radar systems, contributing to a potential Chinese defense in depth of the area should hostilities break out in the region. CSIS considers Johnson Reef to have been a test run for more sophisticated military structures at more famous and well-armed places like Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. The Tianjing Hao was far from the only such ship in China's dredging operations, which can only be described as having been a success. To counter China's Great Wall of Sand island-building campaign, the United States Navy has conducted Freedom of Navigation operations, FONOPs, since 2015. These operations see the close transit of US Navy ships and aircraft around the artificial islands in an attempt to ensure that the South China Sea's shipping lanes stay open. These FONOPs have done little to alter the situation in the South China Sea, however, and numerous close calls between the American and Chinese militaries in the area have led some in Washington to call for them to end. On the flip side, other national security strategists believe that ending the FONOPs and essentially ceding the military prerogative in the area to China would only allow Beijing to entrench itself in the region that much further. Without the United States Navy maintaining a presence in the area, they fear that China's People's Liberation Army Navy would be completely unfettered in asserting its will over the shipping lanes and other countries in the area. Fortunately for the United States and China's weaker regional neighbors, the US Navy might no longer need to do the heavy work alone. Nature itself is assisting in the effort to prevent Chinese hegemony in the South China Sea, because the artificial islands are starting to erode and sink. As early as 2019, it became apparent that China's islands were not as stable as Beijing was hoping for. In the first place, China has extended its reputation for often shoddy construction methods to the new islands. The Economist reported that the concrete China used in building the island bases could not cope with the elemental settings in the area. This concrete was instead turning to sponge in such conditions. Additionally, there is vast corruption within China's construction industry. This corruption has extended to China's military ambitions before. For example, in 2019, Su Bo, the overseer of construction for China's Liaoning aircraft carrier, was convicted on corruption charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Corruption in the construction industry has often led to substandard work, and the same appears to be the case on many of the artificial islands in the South China Sea. As is often the case, China appears to have cut corners in its construction methods. The concrete which displayed problems was not laid properly on all of the islands. For best results, metal rods should have first been driven into the seabed and then a concrete retaining wall built around the island. This was not always the case, and the structural integrity of some of the islands has begun to erode because of this lack of precaution. For China, speed and cheapness was the priority in these island-building campaigns, which explains why they were built so rapidly. Perhaps international observers should have been a little less alarmed. Much like China's Belt and Road infrastructure projects and domestic building efforts, quality control was not at the top of the list of priorities in the islands. It also does not help that China has little experience with building structures that would be designed to survive in the type of elements seen in the South China Sea. Beijing made the matter worse and exacerbated its disadvantage by refusing to call in foreign experts for assistance during the island-building campaign. The result is that the islands and the infrastructure that make up the bases on top of them were not constructed with top-of-the-line materials. In fact, the islands at Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratlys were so unstable that fighter jets from the People's Liberation Army Air Force (PLAAF) had not landed on the airfields there by 2020. This is unlike Woody Island in the Paracels, which China has militarized with a runway capable of supporting the landing of heavy bombers, a feat it had demonstrated in 2018. The lack of use of the runways in the Spratly bases begs the question of why China would choose to build such long structures if they were not going to be used for aircraft. Experts concede that the decision not to land military aircraft there may be seen as a gesture of goodwill to reduce tensions in the region. However, given China's brazen and belligerent stance, this is unlikely. By far the likelier explanation is that the islands are in some way an illusion and cannot support such operations. The weather and climate will also be problems for China going forward. A hit from a powerful typhoon could prove far more devastating to the Chinese constructions than their shoddy concrete. As ocean water warms with a warming global climate, these super typhoons will probably occur in the South China Sea more frequently. China appears to have made no plans for this contingency, however. One super typhoon in the South China Sea hitting in the wrong place might undo all the years of effort Beijing put into its island-building campaign. A warming climate causes other difficulties for China's artificial islands. These islands were not built with any seawalls or other protective infrastructure to preserve them against rising waters. However, as the climate warms, glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic melt and add to rising seas. Since 1992, global sea levels have risen by almost 4 inches and continue to rise at a rate of about 0.15 inches per year. NASA predicts that by 2050, sea levels along the American coastline could be 10 to 12 inches higher than they are today, and the more global temperatures warm, the faster the glaciers will melt and the more rapidly the ocean will rise. For example, the ocean rose twice as fast between 2013 and 2022 than it had between 1993 and 2002. Although it's uncertain how far sea levels will rise by the end of the century, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that in the best-case scenario, sea levels will rise between 11 and 21.5 inches from now to then. In worst-case scenarios, where competition between states and resurgent nationalism takes priority over environmental concerns, sea levels could rise as high as 40 inches. These sea level rises do not necessarily mean that all coastal communities as they currently exist will need to evacuate. Many communities have seawalls and other defenses. However, China's artificial islands are built at sea level and have no such defenses against erosion and rising waters. China meant the islands to be a string of permanent fortifications in the South China Sea, but it did not build them in a way that would be fit for this purpose. The problem of sea level rise gets worse when one considers that China destroyed vast swathes of coral reef and mangroves in the construction efforts. These structures form a natural barrier against the elements. This is because they break waves and dissipate their energy. Coral reefs allow for sediment to establish itself on the shallow and flat portions of the reef, where mangroves can establish themselves. Once there, the mangroves further break apart the energy of waves and storm surges, since the roots and trunks of the trees absorb some of the water. When taken together, these coral reefs and mangroves provide a first line of defense against things like sea level rise and storm surges from typhoons. However, China destroyed these same ecosystems when it began constructing its artificial islands. In an ironic twist that some observers might call a case of poetic justice, China wiped out the very defenses that their islands would have needed to have more staying power in the wake of a warming climate, rising sea levels, and more frequent and powerful typhoons. In 2019, China claimed that it would begin work to restore the coral reefs in the Spratly Islands. China's Ministry of Natural Resources said that facilities to protect and recover these reefs had been installed on Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief reefs. It also said it would survey more areas to identify where coral reefs had been damaged or destroyed and adopt a combination of natural and artificial methods to help the reefs recover themselves. However, China does not exactly have a good track record in this area because in 2015, its State Oceanic Administration claimed that construction of the artificial islands did not alter the health of the Spratly Islands ecosystem. These statements came at the same time that ships like the Tianying Hao were dredging and pulverizing the coral reefs. China also claimed that overfishing and natural causes had damaged the reef long before construction began. With such history, it's little wonder why few trusted China's word in 2019. And about 5 years later, there is still little evidence that China has meaningfully worked to restore the coral reefs in the Spratly Islands. Perhaps as sea levels rise and the risk of severe typhoons increase, Beijing will have no choice but to try to make good on its word out of calculations of self-interest. It has invested significant national prestige into its artificial island building campaign and created much bitterness around the world as the price for it. If these islands were to fail in their purpose, Beijing will have wasted a large amount of resources for little gain. However, there is another danger that comes with investing so much to try to shore the artificial islands up. Such investment in some ways defeats the very reason to build fortifications in the first place. The purpose of fortification is not to be an impregnable defense, but to make it more costly for an enemy to project power, and to free resources for the builder of the fortification to project power in other theaters. By leaving comparatively few soldiers or weapon systems in a fortification, these assets of military power can be deployed elsewhere where they can be put to better use. However, at the rate the islands are deteriorating and threatened by weather and climate, China might need to continually concentrate resources on saving this Great Wall of Sand, rather than using it as an effective method of statecraft. The fortifications that were supposed to be an aid to Chinese power projection might increasingly become a drain on it, as they become more expensive to maintain in terms of money and labor hours spent on them. In some ways, the problems facing the artificial islands in the South China Sea were predictable, as they follow a historical pattern concerning China. China is and always has been a colossus of a nation. However, it also has a history of not being able to live up to its full potential. For example, it was the wealthiest country in the world even into the 19th century. But despite this, it was unable to effectively use this advantage to compete with the Western powers and Japan. Now, history might be repeating itself. China is again a wealthy and powerful nation, but it is increasingly plagued with problems that might not permit it to achieve the full potential of its recovered status on the world stage. The expansion in the South China Sea has mirrored this age-old conundrum for Beijing. At first, it appeared the island-building campaign would solidify its place on the road to hegemony in the area. But through alienation of its neighbors, poor planning, and shoddy construction, these edifices might be the latest example of history repeating itself, with China not being able to take advantage of its latent potential. The islands were supposed to be a signal to the world that China was back, rejuvenated, as Xi Jinping might say. But if they sink, it will be a signal of another sort. There is no doubt that the artificial islands succeeded in accomplishing China's short-term goals for the South China Sea. However, the game of nations is always a marathon and not a sprint. If the islands cannot stay for the long haul, they will cost China far more than they have gained for it. But what do you think about China's artificial islands in the South China Sea? Do you think they will have the staying power and can be an effective method of power projection for China in the future? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. For all of the military advancements that China has made in recent years, it still can't compete with the US in one area: the skies. The US Air Force is a terrifying prospect for China for many reasons, not least because it knows that America leads the charge when it comes to the quality of its equipment and its pilots. And if war were to ever break out between the countries, China would find itself cowering before the might of America's craft. But why? China has a very strong military. It's the second largest military spender in the world, just behind the US, and it's ramping up its nuclear capabilities with every passing year. But when it comes to the skies, China pales in comparison, and Beijing knows it. The reason for China's fear starts with one of the most crucial aspects of warfare: sheer numbers. The simple fact is that the US's airborne capabilities stretch far beyond anything that China can handle. According to Global Firepower, America has a little over 660,000 Air Force personnel. Of course, not all of these are pilots. The US doesn't have the ability to send a 500,000-strong death fleet of planes in China's direction, but what it does have is an extensive infrastructure of pilots and support crews that can coordinate massive offensives that would cause major problems for Beijing. That's not to say that China doesn't have an impressive number of personnel itself. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has about 400,000 members. Impressive numbers, though over 260,000 fewer than the US Air Force. Of course, it's not just people who make up an Air Force. Equipment is a vital component. That's where the US really comes out on top. It has a total stock of 13,300 aircraft, 9,975 of which are combat-ready, compared to China's fleet of 3,166. In other words, the United States has about 4 times the number of aircraft that China has, meaning it would easily overwhelm the PLAAF in terms of sheer numbers. Digging deeper, it's clear that China has focused most of its Air Force spending on fighter jets, with the country having 1,199 of these types of planes available. But even that impressive number pales in comparison to the United States, which has 1,914 fighters, along with a far more versatile fleet of planes that go beyond dogfighting capabilities. For instance, the US has 962 fixed-wing transports compared to China's 288. It also has far more planes available for training, with China having less than a sixth of the 2,634 craft that the US can use to give its next generations of pilots some much-needed flight experience. No matter where you look, be it attack planes, tankers, helicopters, or special mission planes, America comes out on top every single time. Its air-based firepower is on a level that no other military can match. The US simply has more options when it comes to moving its troops around and conducting air missions against China or its territorial partners. That's not to say that the PLAAF is useless. It would be able to cause some damage to America's forces, but for every plane that Beijing could down, the US would have plenty in reserve, ready to replace it. In a war of attrition, China's stock would run low far sooner, giving the US complete dominance of the skies. Still, sheer numbers aren't the only way that a battle is won. Quality of equipment is just as important, and what better place to look than the crown jewels of each country's fighters? For China, that crown jewel, at least right now, is the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, a stealth fighter that entered into service in 2018, following its maiden flight in 2011. It's a fifth-generation plane that was designed specifically to compete with America's F-22 Raptor. The plane is capable of a top speed of about 1,670 miles per hour and can fly for almost 2,800 miles before it needs to refuel. It has low jet engine intakes and is barely visible on a radar cross-section, making it ideal for sneak attacks, and it comes equipped with an active electronically scanned array (AESA) that transmits targeting data directly to its firing systems. Speaking of those firing systems, the craft comes equipped with an internal cannon that can be deployed during close-quarters combat. A pair of bays underneath the craft can hold several PL-10 air-to-air missiles. with another bay in its belly carrying larger PL-21 and PL-12CD missiles. In all, it's a flying death machine that can rain fire on an opponent through a combination of built-in guns and missile strikes. So it's no surprise that China is building as many as possible. Nikkei Asia even suggested that it built more J-20s in 2022 than the 187 F-22s that America manufactured, with plans in place to produce another 40 to 50 per year for the foreseeable future. Of course, not all of those craft will go straight into the PLAAF, with China having the opportunity to sell some. Still, it's an impressive fighter. And if its sole opponent in the US Air Force was the F-22 that it seems to have been built as a counterpart to, China would at least be able to claim parity with the United States. But it's not just the F-22 that China has to worry about. The F-35 is another of the US's best fighters, and the combined force of both would overwhelm the J-20. Where China is focusing most of its efforts on a single fighter, the US has two extremely advanced aircraft that give it more versatility. The F-22 is the closest to the J-20, with its top speed of about 1,500 miles per hour, being just a smidge below the J-20's. It has an external radar cross-section, which makes it remarkably difficult to detect, and is able to supercruise. That means it's able to maintain supersonic speeds without the need for afterburners, making it even harder to detect. The thrust vectoring system built into the aircraft also makes it one of the most agile ever made. So even if the J-20 is faster than the F-22, it may not be able to hit it. It's worth focusing on the ability to supercruise a little more for a simple reason. The J-20 can't do it. In fact, none of the fighters in China's stock can, because they're all equipped with the WS-10 Taihang, a turbofan engine that delivers high thrust but can't maintain supersonic speeds without engaging afterburners. That's a problem for stealth operations. Whenever a craft engages its afterburners, it essentially gives the game away when it comes to its location. So for a J-20 to maintain supersonic speeds, it has to let the US know where it is. But for the F-22 and F-35, supercruising can be used to maintain high speeds, with a large weapons load, while the craft itself essentially appears as barely visible on most radar systems. As for the F-35, it's actually a touch slower than both the J-20 and F-22, being capable of hitting a top speed of 1,200 miles per hour. However, it has slightly more advanced avionics, the tech inside the craft, than the F-22. Both have advanced systems that include radar, sensors, and communication systems. However, the F-35 adds to that with a helmet-mounted display, which can show the pilot real-time information about both their plane and the surrounding environment. But the standout feature of this plane is its ability to take off from a very short runway before landing vertically. In other words, it's able to operate from bases that don't have large runways, such as assault ships and smaller airfields. That's a capability that neither the F-22 nor the J-20 can match. And of course, both the F-22 and F-35 have similar weapon systems, with cannons and air-to-air missiles to match the J-20. In a straight comparison, the J-20 seems to come out just about on top, but the F-22 is very close. And when combined with the more versatile F-35, America would definitely have the advantage in pure dogfighting capabilities. And when you add the ability to supercruise into the mix, America's top fighters have a clear advantage over China's in the stealth game. In short, China knows that it's chasing the US when it comes to its fighters. The J-20 is a direct response to the F-22, and even China's experiments with unmanned flights ape those already conducted by the US. Beijing is playing catch-up. And while it's closing the distance, it's far from achieving air superiority based on numbers or equipment. Speaking of air superiority, China is also terrified of America's Air Force because it takes a very different approach to the PLAAF. China tends to focus on using its planes to support its ground troops, rather than to establish a superior presence in the skies. It's a similar approach to the one that Russia has tried to use in Ukraine, with planes flying low to take out ground-based targets. But this approach has two problems. First, it makes planes vulnerable. Providing support to ground-based troops means flying low, and the lower you go, the closer you get to anti-air defense. This is a lesson that Russia has learned quickly during its invasion of Ukraine, with Ukraine's anti-air defenses already being responsible for shooting down at least 130 craft by August 2023, according to RAND. The fact that China takes a similar approach will be terrifying to Beijing, because it means that it's tactically outmatched by the US. And when you consider the fact that the US has far superior anti-air equipment to Ukraine, the situation would only become more dire for China's pilots. Second, China's ground-focused approach naturally takes its focus away from the skies. That's where America could come swooping in to dominate China's airspace thanks to 5 letters: COMAO. COMAO stands for Composite Air Operations, and the idea behind this tactic is to bring a versatile range of capabilities into a single airborne attack. Typically, that means several countries combining their forces and their craft in joint operations, where one set of planes may provide ground support, for instance, another set may circle the skies, defending against any fighters that would draw near. The ultimate goal is to create one large package of aircraft that combines their forces to essentially take over several hundred square miles of airspace. A COMAO usually has a package commander who coordinates the routes, timings, and targets for the aircraft, and because the package is so large, some COMAOs incorporate up to 100 planes and helicopters. There is built-in redundancy. If a craft or a mission fails, there are others on hand to replace it and launch a secondary assault. This is a problem for China. With its planes generally focused on the ground, the US could use COMAO tactics to dominate the skies above. Its fighters will be able to launch aerial assaults, both on China's planes and targets on the ground, while the PLAAF would lose the ability to escape danger by gaining altitude, because more American flyers would be stationed higher up to greet them. Combine all of this with the fact that COMAOs usually bring together multiple countries, the US would likely involve NATO in its operations, and you get exceptionally coordinated attacks that far outstrip anything that the PLAAF can do. In short, the US would have complete air superiority. And even without support from other countries or NATO, America has such a versatile stock of aircraft that it could essentially launch COMAOs on its own, with China having little recourse due to only coming close to matching the states in fighter plane numbers, with everything else falling behind. Versatility is clearly the key, and it's the lack of it that would have Beijing running scared if the US started launching complex aerial attacks combined with anti-air defenses. Still, China is at least trying to make up for its lack of aerial tactical nous with new anti-air defenses. In November 2022, the People's Liberation Army (PLA) unveiled the FK-3000 air defense missile system, along with 2 others, the HQ-16FE and the Red 11 systems, at Airshow China 2022. It was the FK-3000 that stole the show, as it comes equipped with a powerful air defense missile that can deflect most standard ammunition used by fighter planes. Add to that a mini-missile designed to resist cluster bombs and a special transmitter to jam radio signals, and it's a powerful anti-air force. Even better for China, much of the vehicle that holds this weaponry is remote-controlled. That includes its transporter, erector, launcher, and radar (TELAR) platform, which holds a turret that can be fired remotely to fend off attacks. More support comes from a pair of auxiliary vehicles, again unmanned, that can handle ground combat to defend the main vehicle. The FK-3000 is impressive, but it can't do anything against America's fighters. Instead, it's designed to ward off attack helicopters, cruise missiles, and similar large targets. No stealth detection capabilities means it has its limitations. All of those munitions and equipment could, and likely would, be deployed by the US in a COMAO attack, but the very nature of COMAOs means that China's anti-air defenses would be able to do little against anything other than large targets that are somewhat close to the ground. For the many craft that are either out of range or equipped with stealth technology, the FK-3000 would essentially be useless. Again, we see Beijing doing what it's doing with fighters, playing catch-up. Of course, you could argue that the US couldn't launch an aerial attack from home soil to China. The distance is too great to fly from one country to the other, essentially protecting each one against the other's aerial forces, right? That's not the case. According to Al Jazeera, the United States maintains 750 bases around the world, with at least 220 of those bases being in Asian countries that could easily put the US into range. Japan is the frontrunner and a vital military partner to the US with 120 bases, South Korea coming in close behind with 73, Australia hosts 7, and will likely build more as its military ties to the US grow, with both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia having 10 US bases. Looking at a map of the world, you'll see why this is such a problem for China. Combined, those bases offer coverage from the east, west, and south. China is essentially surrounded by major countries that hosts US troops and could, in the event of war, become launching points for COMEOs and other American aerial operations. In contrast, China only has one official remote military base located in Djibouti, meaning it's still not within range, and certainly not to the extent that America is to Beijing. Granted, China is looking to expand its overseas presence. Stars and Stripes reports that Beijing may look to build new bases in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia in the coming years. Plus, its investments in infrastructure projects in many Asian and African countries provide it with some leverage to establish more bases in the future. But to achieve the type of coverage that the US has, China would need to establish a presence in South America and Canada, neither really being options for Beijing. China is trying to catch up once again. It's doing so covertly, especially with its loans for infrastructure projects that could place many smaller countries in its back pocket. But the US is far ahead in that game, because it's established itself in several Asian countries that put it within striking distance of China. Simply put, America can launch attacks on China without Beijing being able to reciprocate, at least without a lot of effort and aircraft carriers, putting China at yet another aerial disadvantage. Still, if China had better pilot training, that would at least be something it could hold against the States. Unfortunately for Beijing, it doesn't. According to Air Education and Training Command, AETC, the US Air Force Academy pumps out over 3,400 cadets every year. Those cadets are training in the principles and techniques used to fly advanced planes and helicopters, in addition to receiving ground training, so they're at least somewhat effective if they're grounded. Some cadets also undergo officer development training, which improves their leadership and coordination skills. After completing this primary phase, the cadets are split into 3 groups, with each being an advanced training course focused on a specific type of craft. These groups include one for bombers and fighters, another for helicopter training, and yet another that teaches advanced operation of tankers and airlift planes. A fourth, and constantly growing, group is also selected to learn how to remotely fly unmanned craft. All told, a pilot cadet will get between 180 and 240 hours of flight training before they're deployed in the field, leaving them well equipped to handle almost anything thrown at them. As with everything else, the PLAAF lags behind in the training department. Beijing is aware of this too, which is why it's engaging in a concerted campaign to bring more Western influence into its training program. According to Sky News, the PLA started a recruitment drive in late 2022 aimed at attracting British military personnel to help train its pilots. The outlet says that around 30 former British pilots took the payday, with salaries reputed to be around £240,000, or approximately $300,000 per year. However, some are calling the move a breach of security. That makes sense. Not only do these British pilots have more experience than many of China's flyers, but they also understand Western aircraft. Who's to say they won't divulge secrets? This is obviously distressing news for all Western countries, including the US, but it's also an indicator that China is playing catch-up in training just as much as everywhere else. It wants to know how Western powers operate. It needs to find and benefit from experience that its own trainers simply don't have. And as long as it's offering so much money in exchange for that knowledge, it will be able to attract people who can improve its training outcomes. This could be a sign that China is getting desperate. And beyond splashing the cash to attract better trainers, it's also trying to force pilots through their training faster than ever before. In a July 2022 article, Le Monde reported that China had proudly proclaimed that cadets trained in the J-10, one of its multi-role fighters, had completed their training in 3 years rather than the standard 6. That was big news for Beijing. It had only started training pilots using the J-10s in 2010, with such a fast pilot turnaround being put down to an increased ability to conduct tactical training and live for operations. But is that really the case? Or is Beijing making the same mistake that Moscow makes by failing to ensure that its cadets have enough flight hours to be effective once they're engaged in active warfare? What China claims as a victory in training efficiency could simply be a rush job that says something very different. We're scared of the US, and we need more pilots now. Beyond that, secrecy surrounds China's Air Force training, as it does with so much of the PLA's operations, with propaganda and the occasional news report being the main sources of what they actually do. Regardless, Beijing recognizes the superiority of Western training. If it didn't, it wouldn't be spending around $9 million per year on former British pilots. But even if the Brits can teach China a thing or two, There's one more reason for Beijing to cower in the face of America's aerial might: nuclear weapons. The US and China are both capable of launching nukes, with China's growing arsenal being an obvious cause for concern for all Western nations. However, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation (CAC) points out that it has extremely limited options when it comes to dropping nukes from the air. At best, it may be able to equip a plane with a nuke and hope to achieve a clean drop, but it's more likely that the plane will be shot out of the sky long before it delivered its payload. Beijing is trying to do something about this. The CAC reports that its development of the Zhan H-20 stealth bomber is likely to give it better nuclear capabilities from the skies, especially as its design is purposefully similar to the America's B-2 bomber. But that plane likely won't enter service until 2025 at the earliest, leaving China with no aerial nuclear threat until then. The US has that threat in abundance. Atomic Archive points out that the States has 2 bombers capable of launching nukes: the previously mentioned B-2A Spirit and the B-52H Stratofortress. What's more, it has 850 warheads, though not all being in commission, that it could launch from these planes. That stockpile is larger than the 350 total nukes that China is believed to have, which is already scary for Beijing. The fact that these bombs can be launched from the skies, likely out of the reach of any of China's anti-air defenses, is terrifying. Again, China is playing catch-up by trying to develop a bomber with similar capabilities. But until it has that and can manufacture at pace, the US will always hold the ultimate trump card if it somehow manages to lose in all other aspects on the aerial front. But based on what we've shared here, that isn't likely to happen. The US has more, better-trained pilots and far more aircraft than the PLAAF. It has superior tactics because it knows how to use its versatile fleet to conduct coordinated attacks designed to achieve air supremacy rather than simply support ground troops. Plus, thanks to the US having bases established in so many countries that surround China, it's far more capable of launching attacks over Chinese airspace than Beijing is over America's territory. And even if all of that superiority fails to deliver an aerial victory for the US, it can always press the big red button and launch nukes from the sky to devastate China. It's no wonder that China is running scared. The only worry for the US Air Force is that China is trying to run toward it rather than away. With all of its investment into military modernization, coupled with Beijing's willingness to spend big to attract pilots, we may see China becoming a stronger aerial force in years to come. But what do you think? Is China right to be terrified of America's aerial capabilities? Or does it have some way to mitigate them that we haven't explored here? As always, tell us what you think in the comments section. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. India has lured China into a trap. For years, the 2 powerhouse nations have been involved in a cat-and-mouse battle to gain ascendancy over the much-coveted Indian Ocean region. Only now, through canny political maneuvering and the signing of many trade and military treaties, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has outwitted his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, all of which has put India in pole position to control one of the most sought-after areas in the world. Make no mistake though, this isn't something Beijing will take lying down, and it's something the rest of the world will ignore at its peril. At this point in the video, you would be forgiven for feeling slightly confused. Aren't China and India partners in one of the biggest intergovernmental associations in the world, BRICS? The answer is, of course, yes. So why have India and China become embroiled in what many see as dangerous Cold War-style posturing and rhetoric, not to mention a huge buildup of military and strategic strength? In a geopolitical context, the answer to that question is as murky as it is complex. But the ultimate goal is simple enough to explain: the aforementioned riches associated with the Indian Ocean and everything that goes with it. The importance of this region and who ultimately controls it is nothing new, however. Way back in 1897, Alfred Thayer, an admiral in the US Navy, made this bold prediction: whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. The destiny of the world will be decided on its waters. From as early as the 3rd century BCE, the Indian Ocean trade routes have connected Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. At present, more than 2/3 of the world's oil is transported through the region's waters. But it's not just oil exports that rely on the crucial trade route, but coal exports too. 3 nations with developing economies, Australia, Indonesia, and South Africa, now account for more than half of global coal exports, shipping much of it across the Indian Ocean to India, China, Japan, and South Korea. And what about the fisheries industry? According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization (FAO), a truly staggering 11.3 million tons of fish were caught in 2010, about 14.6% of the world's catch. In the same year, 6 Indian Ocean nations – India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, Egypt, and Myanmar – supplied over 11.3 million tons of fish between them, as much as the rest of the regions combined. The Indian Ocean is not only one of the most lucrative maritime trade and fishing routes on the planet, but also home to vast natural resources, the majority of which have yet to be exploited to the full. According to Insight on India (IAS), nodules containing nickel, cobalt, and iron, and gargantuan sulfide deposits of manganese, copper, iron, zinc, silver, and gold are all present in huge quantities on the seabed. But it doesn't end there. The sediments found in the Indian Ocean are important sources of titanium, zirconium, tin, zinc, and copper. To qualify, back in 2017, the Indian Ocean economies accounted for 35.5% of global iron production, 17.8% of world gold production, 16.8% of the world's proven oil reserves, and 27.9% of proven natural gas reserves. That's just a small example of exactly what's at stake here, and why India and China have set themselves on a seeming collision course that could have huge global ramifications. Before we dig even deeper into this most intriguing of geopolitical chess matches, however, we need to give ourselves some demographic context. China and India are two of the biggest nations in the world. China has a population of 1,425,347,415. India, 1,425,775,850. In terms of landmass, China boasts around 9.6 million square meters, about 3.7 million square miles, and India approximately 3.29 million square meters, about 1.2 million square miles. Last year, China's gross domestic product (GDP) was $17.52 trillion. India's GDP for the same period was $3.75 trillion. Militarily, China has over 2 million active servicemen and women, and a stockpile of 500 nuclear warheads. India has around 1.2 million active servicemen and women and 164 nuclear weapons, with the present capacity to increase that number to 200 in the near future. We're talking about true global heavyweights in every respect. But how did we get to where we are today? In 5 words, the Belt and Road Initiative. Back in 2012, Wang Jixi of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University published a paper that would reshape Beijing's foreign policy objectives. In essence, his paper, Marching West, recommended that China turn away from its powerful allies of the United States in the East, the familiar faces of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and focus more on Central Asia and the Middle East. When Xi came to power a year later, he initiated a new economic program, later known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Around that time, China had just started to send goods to European markets on trains that followed the 2,000-year-old Silk Road routes across the steppes of Central Asia. When the other nations in Southeast Asia asked to be included, Xi was only too happy to oblige with a maritime Silk Road link between Southeast Asia and South Asia to East Africa. And thus, the Belt and Road Initiative was born. So why would this project lead to so much tension between China and India, especially when you consider the international investment the project attracted? By 2019, Hungary, Portugal, and Italy, a member of the group of 7 leading industrialized democracies, had signed agreements to cooperate. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and countries across Latin America and Africa quickly followed suit. Surely a new lucrative trade route is a good and positive development for all countries concerned. On paper, yes, it is. But as alluded to at the start of the video, there are much bigger prizes at stake here. India's concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative are pressing and manifold. First and foremost, Modi fears that participating in the program would only strengthen China's strategic influence in the region. Naturally, this is something New Delhi wants to avoid at all costs. Granted, improving trade routes with China is all well and good, but India is rightly concerned about its own security and geopolitical interests. India has also expressed concern about the financial implications. The more vociferous critics in New Delhi argue that the Belt and Road Initiative gives China unfair leverage over other countries. If left unchallenged, this could lead to economic and political dependence on China, and eventually result in Beijing expanding its military presence in the Indian Ocean region. But how exactly? Over recent years, China has adopted a dubious and, some would say, mercenary policy whereby Beijing offers financial, infrastructural, or military aid to a lesser nation. However, the repayment terms have an ambiguous dynamic attached to them. In a CNN report from March 2023, China is said to have loaned massive sums to countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa, extending its global influence through mega infrastructure projects and becoming one of the world's biggest creditors in the process. According to Brad Parks, co-author of a joint study from the World Bank, Harvard Kennedy School, Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and the US-based research lab Aid Data, Beijing has created a new global system for cross-border rescue lending, but it has done so in an opaque and uncoordinated way. But what are we talking about in terms of figures? China has spent over $240 billion bailing out 22 countries involved in the Belt and Road Infrastructure project, including Argentina, Pakistan, Kenya, and Turkey. An act of global altruism, or a cynical way to exploit countries in their time of need and make them indebted to you in more ways than just the financial. If we adopt the latter mindset, we can construct the following hypothetical situation. Your country is one of those bailed out by Beijing. Naturally, you're hugely grateful, even more so when Xi doesn't come hammering on your door for repayment anytime soon. But what happens if China's leader makes a request to, say, build a military base on your territory, one that might, for instance, make people in New Delhi very nervous indeed? A redefinition of the classic rock and hard place conundrum. And hence, we get to the crux of the matter, two behemoth nations with their eyes on the same massive prizes. But perhaps most tellingly of all, and this is as symbolic as it is of practical geographical concern, the route of the Belt and Road Initiative passes through hotly disputed Kashmiri territory that both India and Pakistan stake historical claims, namely Gilgit-Baltistan. This ethnically diverse Himalayan region was mired in controversy long before Pakistan won its independence from the UK in 1947. Under the partition plan contained in the Indian Independence Act, Kashmir was free to accede to either India or Pakistan. Hari Singh, the Maharaja or local ruler, initially wanted Kashmir to be independent. However, in October 1947, he chose to join India in return for its help against aggression from Pakistani tribespeople. War broke out. India sought the United Nations intercession to decide the dispute, and even though a ceasefire ensued, the situation has remained volatile up until the present day, with a full-blown, if short-lived war breaking out in 1999, with tens of thousands of lives being lost. The eventual creation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC) in 2015 only added fuel to the fire. India felt this was a direct violation of its territorial sovereignty and was the main reason why India refused to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Fast forward to today and tensions are still running high. In a report in the Hindustan Times from February 2024, former Ambassador Vishnu Prakash claimed that India is decoupling from China and it was no longer business as usual between the two countries. Furthermore, he alleged that there is an unholy alliance between China and Pakistan that will thwart India's initiatives. However, the Belt and Road Initiative is only one part of the puzzle. As we'll shortly explain, both countries have been incredibly active in recent decades. Slowly but surely, they have attempted to gain a strategic stranglehold on the region. If China made one move, India was quick to react with a move of their own. And while China may arguably have the stronger allies, it's India who looks to have put the better military strategy into place to secure their short, medium, and long-term objectives. At the top of the video, we made a pretty bold and wide-reaching claim. India has lured China into a trap. But in every game of cat and mouse, there is constant pursuit, near captures, and repeated escapes. Never more so than when the diamond necklace and string of pearls strategies collided. Confused? Don't worry. Despite the somewhat elaborate imagery conjured by the respective names, these two strategies are easy to understand, especially if you visualize a map with a diamond or pearl adornment draped around the countries involved. Firstly, let's look at China's so-called string of pearls strategy for the Indian Ocean region. According to a report from China Briefing, China is primarily focused on strengthening its ties with Sri Lanka. Why? Simply put, China needs to secure foreign oil and trade routes that are critical to its expansion in the area. How? by establishing an increased level of influence along sea routes through investment, port development, and diplomacy. These investments extend from Hainan Island in the South China Sea through the littorals of the Straits of Malacca. It includes port developments in Chittagong, Bangladesh, Sittwe, Koko, Hyanggi, Khaokpyu, Mergui, and Sadek Kyun in Myanmar, Liam Chabang in Thailand, and Sihanoukville in Cambodia. A wide net indeed. To give you a better idea of the scale of the strategy, these routes run across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Pakistan's Gwadar port, and islands within the Arabian Sea, and into the Persian Gulf. But it hasn't all been plain sailing, far from it, and as the old saying goes, necessity is often the mother of creation. The lack of progress on the Kra Canal project in Thailand, which would directly link the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, has been cited as a motivating factor in the development of this policy. Ultimately, it will provide a greater presence for China along the sea lines of communication that now anchor the country directly to the Middle East. Naturally, this has proved incredibly disquieting for both India and the United States. They don't know whether this strategy is intended to cement supply lines and trade routes, or whether China is aiming for regional supremacy. But if history teaches us anything, it's best to plan for the worst eventuality. That way you'll be prepared to act if circumstances go against you. India's response? The Diamond Necklace Strategy. What could easily be described as a counter-encirclement strategy against the Chinese expansion we outlined a moment ago. Originally coined by former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh, India has opted for a multi-pronged program, including the building of ports and extensive coastal surveillance radar (CSR) systems to track Chinese warships and submarines. Ultimately, this will solidify defense ties, expand bilateral relations with South Asian countries, island nations in the Indian Ocean region, and Southeast Asian nations, and include regular military exercises with US, Japanese, and Australian naval forces. But what will this achieve exactly? First and foremost, important military and strategic agreements with Vietnam, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand have all been signed, all of which will help India fight back against Chinese expansion in the region. Just as importantly, the strategy will help India access and build ports crucial for its own trade initiatives. But where will these ports likely be located? India is developing the Chabahar port in Iran, opening a new land-sea route to Central Asian countries and bypassing Pakistan. Strategically close to the Chinese Gwadar port, it's also located close to the Strait of Hormuz. This will put India in a great position since it overlooks the Gulf of Oman, a crucially important oil supply route. India is also building deep-sea ports in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Myanmar with similar strategic objectives. Furthermore, Modi has signed agreements to access naval facilities in Oman and Singapore. This first facility is again close to the Strait of Hormuz, where over 30% of oil exports travel through. The second, on the Changi Naval Base in Singapore, is strategically located close to the Strait of Malacca. And it doesn't stop there. In 2022, India strengthened its historic links to Mongolia and added another diamond to its strategic necklace, an alliance too close for comfort, no doubt, for China. According to India's Economic Times, India has agreed to fund a new greenfield oil refinery project in South Gobi to the tune of $1.2 billion. No small change. India also knows the importance of building solid radar networks. For that reason, they have done deals with Bangladesh, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. By constructing ports and signing bilateral agreements, India hopes to improve trade ties with the respective nations and open different trade routes, all of which will help India to stymie Chinese influence in these countries and promote India's own economic objectives along the way. Even more worrying from a Chinese perspective, India is also a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, an informal alliance of nations comprising the US, Australia, India, and Japan. While not a formal alliance, the Quad represents a strong and real challenge to Chinese hegemony on the global stage. Ostensibly, this group was set up after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. Since then, however, one of the group's main objectives, even if not overtly stated, is to curb China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean and both the East and South China Seas. Back in 2022, right after the COVID-19 crisis, Japan hosted a summit to discuss the post-pandemic world. According to a report by the Council on Foreign Relations (CFR), the leaders spoke of their resolve to uphold the international rules-based order where countries are free from all forms of military, economic, and political coercion. This broadside was clearly aimed at China's growing use of its economic might to achieve political gains. In that respect, Australia, India, and Japan have all recently felt China's coercive pressures. Speaking of Japan, China's historical adversary, Tokyo signed a trade deal with India back in 2011. The India-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement effectively eliminates tariffs on 90% of Japanese exports to India, including auto parts and electric appliances, and 97% of imports from India, including agricultural and fisheries products. But how does India's membership of these organizations and the signing of these trade deals affect its standing in BRICS? As mentioned at the top of the video, China and India aren't just antagonistic nations locking horns like rutting stags, but members of the same intergovernmental alliance. Founded in 2009 as BRIC, it wasn't until South Africa joined in 2010 that it became BRICS. The basic objective of the alliance was to give emerging economies more influence in international politics. Whether the group has achieved that objective is still up for debate. What can't be denied, with the inclusion of more states, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, effectively joined on January 1, 2024, is the collective size and influence of the alliance. Let's give you the facts and figures to back that claim up. The expanded group has a combined population of about 3.5 billion, or 45% of the world's inhabitants. Their economies are worth more than $28.5 trillion, or about 28% of the global economy. Over recent years, however, India has been an increasingly marginalized voice in the BRICS structure. Why? Quite simply, India has become involved with too many strategic partnerships. As a result, Modi has often found himself to be the odd man out when it comes to making many key decisions. In short, you can't be everybody's friend and ally, and it's impossible to keep Washington, Moscow, and Beijing happy when pursuing political, economic, and military agendas diametrically opposed to each of their best interests. So has Modi spread India too thin and in the process watered down the country's influence in key strategic decision-making on a global level? And do the other member states of these organizations now see India as an unreliable ally? The answer? Probably. But high-stakes political maneuvering is nothing if not a tightrope act. After all, the rewards are huge. Let's look at an illustrative example from the Quad Summit mentioned above. Naturally, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis in Europe it precipitated were high on the agenda. Tellingly, India found themselves in an incredibly awkward situation again, and for all the wrong reasons. As soon as Putin launched his invasion, all member states, apart from India, imposed brutal sanctions on Russia. But not only that, Modi failed to publicly condemn Putin's actions to the wider international community. Like Pakistan, India abstained from joining a UN resolution. To put that into the appropriate context, only Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria openly refused to sign the resolution. Hardly the best company to be keeping in the broader global context. And again, we have to ask the reason why. India is buying oil from Russia at a heavily discounted rate. While a report from Outlook contends that this is a means to secure India's energy security interests and shouldn't therefore be politicized in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't look good to the watching world. And it's something that won't have escaped Beijing's notice. With that in mind, what of India's future in BRICS and the other alliances it has joined in recent decades? For the time being, it looks as if Modi will keep to the status quo if possible, as he sees membership in organizations with such opposing strategic objectives as an unavoidable inconvenience. Whether that will lead to uncomfortable compromises or unavoidable confrontations later down the line remains to be seen. More important for India is its continued expansion and vigilance, as the global stakes couldn't be any higher. Now we are coming to the end of the video, we have a much clearer picture of the current situation and just how India has reacted to China's expansion into the Indian Ocean region. Through the tireless work of its leader, India has responded to each geopolitical roll of the dice with a decisive move of its own. Be it in strategic, militaristic, economic, or political alliances, the diamond necklace looks as if it could put China on a tight leash for many years to come. But what do you think about the state of play at the present time? Has India really drawn China into a trap with its military strategy? Or do you think Beijing has something else up its sleeve? With so much at stake, is an outbreak of hostilities between the two nations now almost inevitable? If so, who would come out on top? Both have powerful allies in the region, and both are huge military powers in their own rights. Will the United States and Russia intercede? We only need to look at the destabilizing international effect of the war in Ukraine to know that another conflict is in no one's best interests. Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. What do Ukraine and China have in common? Let's start with geopolitical significance. Both China and Ukraine hold strategic geopolitical importance. China is the world's most populous country, with a population of approximately 1,426,000,000 in 2023, and the second largest economy, preceded by the US. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the second largest country in Europe by land area, with a total area of approximately 232,900 square miles. This means that the second largest country in Europe is roughly 28 times smaller than Europe's largest country, Russia, which spans an area of roughly 6,606,000 square miles. Then there's the fact that both China and Ukraine are connected through China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, making Ukraine an important transit country for the BRI's land-based routes, and thus linking China with Europe. However, lately, a new and deeply disturbing commonality has arisen between both countries: Putin's war on Ukraine. And as bad as it's been for Ukraine itself, it has also been downright disastrous for China. But why? In what way? Let's find out. In today's world, it pays to have friends in high places. Fortunately for the Western world, and especially Ukraine, Russia has virtually none of them. China, however, is among the few. The two neighbor nations are strategic partners, linked economically by $190 billion of annual trade, and politically by virtue of their authoritarian, like-minded leaders. Over the past decades, the two countries have forged closer bilateral ties. Both sides, moreover, view the United States as a hostile actor bent on containing their territorial and cultural ambitions. On the surface, they're like two geopolitical peas in a pod. But all is not as rosy as it seems. Once aspirational partners of Western democracies content, even keen to assimilate these two Eurasian powers into their economic, cultural, and political spheres, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. Russia's once vaunted military has, in many circles, become a laughingstock, and this has reflected poorly on China, whose own extraterritorial designs on its neighbors are well known throughout the world. Most peace-loving nations today view both as a threat, though certainly not on equal levels. One US official perhaps summarized it best: Russia is a hurricane. It comes on hard and fast. China, on the other hand, is climate change. Long, slow, pervasive. Today, China continues to foster close relations with Putin, even though the Russian president headlines the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant list. It's a bad look. But the PRC isn't willing to throw the Kremlin out with the bathwater just yet. Today, we'll discuss why they might want to reconsider that decision, and just how Russia's reverses in Ukraine may influence China's strategic calculus moving forward. Putin's illegal war has been an eye-opening experience for the world. China, as we all know, harbors territorial claims on Taiwan, its independent island neighbor. As such, the United States, Taiwan, and the vast majority of the civilized world place China's ambitions in the same category as Putin's toward Ukraine. Ever since Russian forces stormed across the border in February 2022, the United States and its allies kept a closer eye on China. If the Ukrainian invasion went as well as many thought it would be fair to assume China might feel empowered to attack Taiwan, especially as Europe and the US were distracted by Russia. We can safely say now, over a year in, and knowing what he knows about the complexities of modern joint and combined arms warfare, Xi would have to be stupid to authorize an unprovoked amphibious invasion of Taiwan. So far, there's only one dictator dumb enough to do that, and look how that's going. With each passing day, the PRC is witnessing Russia sink unfathomable amounts of blood and treasure into an almost unwinnable war of attrition. In the wreckage of Bakhmut, the atrocities of Bucha, and the discontent growing in the hearts of babushkas far and wide, China's leadership sees its future plans of easily seizing Taiwan slipping away. War is a hard teacher. For now, China may be content to sit back and learn all it can, while it can. Why then has Putin's invasion become a disaster for China's future plans? Let's dive in. No matter how you cut it, almost every lesson in Ukraine spells bad news for China. So far, China has adopted a unique, long-term, over-the-horizon strategic approach in its posture towards Taiwan. Its primary tactic has not been as in-your-face as you would expect from a rising superpower accustomed to throwing its economic and cultural weight around. But militarily, China has adapted something called grey zone operations to achieve its strategic ends. Grey zone operations are just like they sound, actions on the spectrum between peace and war. These small, compounding confrontations are not designed to escalate into a full-scale war, but they certainly can. They tend to be employed by powerful actors bent on achieving objectives that ordinarily might be illegal or too difficult to do all at once, and often take a variety of forms. These can include cyber attacks or covert espionage, political propaganda and misinformation campaigns, election rigging, economic warfare and sanctions, proxy wars, and the funding of destabilizing insurgencies, or the gradual weakening of alliances and partnerships. One of China's preferred tactics is to slowly increase the number of times it flies into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the internationally recognized airspace around the island, until it almost becomes normal. Along with this, China has recently sent more and more vessels up to and even over the Taiwan Strait median line, demarcating the boundary between both countries. It has deployed men and material onto smaller island chains, man-made and otherwise, in the South China Sea to intimidate and pressure their neighbor. It harasses foreign vessels traversing these waters too, as a Chinese naval vessel recently did to a Philippine Coast Guard patrol just 105 miles off its own coastline. Grey zone operations take place independent from one another, on different days, at different times, just infrequently enough for the world to forget about them in our 24-hour news cycle. It's pretty smart. If China did everything at once, the world would label it as even more of a belligerent and untrustworthy actor than it already does. Collectively, these acts normalize displays of Chinese power, chip away at Taiwan's defensive resolve, condition the West into accepting higher levels of belligerency, and set China up for its ultimate aim. For anyone paying attention, the world has seen this type of behavior before. Vladimir Putin utilized grey zone tactics prior to and during its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, dispatching mercenaries and Russian forces in anonymous green uniforms with no markings to do his bidding, destabilizing the local government and paving the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. Putin told everyone he had no idea who these little green men were, as if. Their disguise as local pro-Russian separatists enabled Putin to claim plausible deniability for their involvement, giving him the ability to achieve his geopolitical aim without officially escalating the crisis into an unwinnable war. That didn't last long. Despite the Kremlin's reliance on grey zone operations, it ultimately could not get everything it wanted without a bigger, pre-planned invasion. And here, China will have certainly taken note. Before 2022, the West could only respond to what seemed a measured, limited invasion with measured, limited sanctions. China can and does expect the same when it pulls similar stunts in the South China Sea. The United States, as yet, hasn't been able to do much to challenge China's construction of artificial islands or its repeated violation of Taiwanese airspace, since it is short of a pronounced, conventional invasion. China can harass and weaken Taiwan in limited ways and still not be seen as overt aggressors. The West can apply economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, but China has weathered this type of response for decades now. Russia's switch from grey zone tactics to full-blown warfare has given China insight into the West's response, and it probably doesn't like what it has seen. The world rallied behind Ukraine, pouring billions of dollars worth of arms and aid into the fight. Its alliances grew stronger, its commitment to defending vulnerable nations, even indirectly, more firm. China now knows what it can expect in a similar Taiwan contingency. If they had plans to invade in the near future, they have probably shelved them for now, and rightly so. Just another reason why Putin's war has not only benefited the West, but also deterred China in the East. There are other lessons to be taken from Russia's invasion. Chief among them, China has learned that size isn't everything. China's military is excellent on paper. It has 2 million active soldiers, 500,000 more than the US. It recently launched its third aircraft carrier, which, compared to anyone besides the US, is a decent number, and now boasts the largest navy in the world by pure numbers. Its defense budget is surpassed only by the US. It has some of the world's best air-to-air hypersonic missiles and attack drones. But China sees that Russia too once boasted similar stats. From Ukraine, China has learned that material and numerical superiority doesn't automatically translate to victory. If it wants to successfully invade Taiwan, it will need far, far more. Russia had by far the more achievable territorial ambitions when it invaded Ukraine compared to China's designs on Taiwan. It had amassed so many tanks and mechanized infantry on Ukraine's border, it was easy to assume, and most did, that Kyiv would quickly capitulate. The countries are right next to each other. Russia had excellent railway access into the country. Save a few key waterways, Ukraine lacks natural defensive features. Russia even had a friendly partner in Belarus, whose territory it used to stage its attack. China would have to surmount a logistical Mount Everest if it commits to a similar invasion plan in Taiwan. Amphibious operations are among the most difficult to pull off, combining the intricacies of air, land, and sea warfare and the logistical challenge of transporting vehicles, men, and weapons across open water to contested shores. China has to cross the 100-mile-wide Strait of Taiwan first and foremost, a span in which it will be vulnerable to barrages of artillery and anti-ship missiles. If the fate of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, is any indication, modern anti-ship missiles can in fact exercise a massively disproportionate influence over the battlefield. When it gets onto the island of Taiwan, assuming it can actually establish a beachhead, it will have to establish and sustain huge stockpiles of supplies shipped over in secure convoys, defend itself from what will undoubtedly be an onslaught of Taiwanese artillery, and withstand any counterattacks that come. Superior numbers may not be enough to win out. Ultimately, the outcome of Russia's invasion is bad news for China for this one simple reason. You cannot intimidate your way to victory in war, especially when the enemy you fight has the moral high ground. Resistance will be fierce and pronounced. Taiwan will not give up simply because China outnumbers them. China has learned other lessons from Ukraine, among them the importance of training in the outcome of military engagements. Just as material superiority won't automatically translate to victory, armies will always struggle to overcome deficiencies in training. It is an indisputable fact that Ukrainian troops are far better trained than their Russian counterparts, mercenary, conscript, or otherwise. Most of Russia's most experienced, best-trained troops, commanders and non-commissioned officers are now dead, and Putin's repeated mobilization efforts have starkly revealed the deficiencies in Russian military training, whether the alarming lack of weapons, vehicles, and live ammunition to train on, unsuitable training sites, poor leadership, a chronic lack of technological enablers, or concern for the general well-being and training up of cohesive collective units. On the other hand, Ukraine has integrated a vast spectrum of foreign munitions, weapons, drones, and technology, eschewing older Soviet models and tactics for more effective Western ones. And that, in tandem with the intelligence they receive on a daily basis, has helped deliver several stunning victories. But while we often talk about the technology behind Ukraine's success, it's certainly no silver bullet. Western weapons are hard to maintain, at least in Ukraine, being both subject to breakdown and difficult to replace when stocks run low. In this discussion, we tend to forget the human element, how hard it is to deploy and use modern weapons effectively. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, Western systems that take a real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. As early as 1993, Ukrainian armed forces were training in the US through the United States National Guard's State Partnership Program. learning to deliver mission-type orders, empower Ukrainian soldiers to make on-the-fly battlefield decisions, and using realistic combat exercises to hone the skills and wartime resilience of Ukrainian personnel. More recently, tens of thousands of Ukrainian officers have received crash courses in modern joint war fighting in Britain, Germany, Poland, and as part of the US Army Europe's Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, a blended task force of Americans, Poles, Lithuanians, Brits, Canadians, and other soldiers established in 2015 to mentor and advise Ukrainian battalions in the art of combined arms warfare. These train-the-trainer programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. The bad news for China is that Taiwan joined a similar US-led program in 2022 and have been integrating Western-built weapons systems far longer than that. Every day that goes by, their military will glean lessons from the best forces in the world, making an invasion that much harder to pull off. Speaking of lessons, it is a well-known fact that Russia underestimated the extent to which Ukraine would receive Western assistance after it was invaded, and China now knows that even if the United States, its allies and partners do not expressly commit hard military power to fight side by side with Taiwanese forces in the event of an invasion, it can be sure that the likelihood the Western world will assist Taiwan in some way is extremely high. Geographic distance from an international hotspot no longer hinders the degree of foreign aid or the level of intervention in the way it once did. Even though a vast Pacific expanse separates Taiwan from the United States, it would still send crucial military and humanitarian aid if China invades. Witnessing the astronomical sums of money donated by NATO member countries to Ukraine will send shivers down Xi Jinping's spine. Thanks to Russia, the West is once more alert to the tangible threat of authoritarianism. Gone are the days of ambivalence or neutrality when it comes to ensuring territorial integrity. China's hopes of the United States staying aloof from a Taiwanese confrontation are long gone. The US has proven willing to send state-of-the-art tanks, high-tech weapons, and advisors to help Ukraine, currently facing its second most pronounced national security threat. We predict it will offer the same assistance, if not more, to Taiwan. This leads to another reason why Russia's experience should send warning signals to China. Just as it has drawn insight from the West's reaction to Russia's invasion, it must recognize that the West, too, has been learning what works and what doesn't when countries threaten to invade their neighbor. China may have taken some confidence from the initial response to Russia's decision to amass troops on Ukraine's border. The West could only threaten to proportionately punish Russian aggression in the vaguest terms, since, technically, it was all still hypothetical. The threat and implementation of economic sanctions was serious, but far from insurmountable. Russia had hoped to win the war quickly and incorporate Ukraine's vast resources and manpower, thus shielding itself from the worst effects of sanctions. Yes, they might temporarily make average Russians uncomfortable in the short term. The long-term strategic benefits of a rapid, decisive victory, however, couldn't be ignored. Once the war was over and Russia controlled Ukraine, it's fair to say that Russia might be able to slowly reduce the impact of sanctions and re-engage in dialogue with the West, as it had after it invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. In a perfect world, China foresees a similar outcome for its own invasion. But Russian setbacks have shown that once the war spirals out of control and the aggressor finds itself on the losing side, the West will move from mere sanctions to deterrence through denial, deploying rapid response troops to the region to prevent things from escalating further as a preventative measure. Because the threat of sanctions was not enough to stop Russia from invading, and when they were implemented they did not alter Russia's behavior to the extent many had hoped, it is possible the West will simply double down on not only arming Taiwan with the weapons and training it needs ahead of time, but redoubling its own presence. This is what Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific nations have already been doing for months now. You can be sure China would much rather deal with sanctions than the latter. Another takeaway is actually a corollary to the idea that the West will go beyond the threat of sanctions. It is the idea that even if sanctions are slow, they do eventually work. China is in an entirely different weight class economically than Russia. US and European officials are well aware that the potential implications of sanctions on China is a far more complex exercise than sanctions on Russia, given US and allies' extensive entanglement with the Chinese economy. At least that is according to Nazak Nikaktar, a former senior US Commerce Department official. China has the world's second largest economy and a massive global supply chain. The war would not only harm them, but the West, which relies on China for countless goods, from shoes to surfboards and cell phones to computers. But if the West is able to target specific corners of China's economy, for example its reliance on foreign-made microchips and telecommunications equipment, it could limit its ability to pursue a long-term military operation. This is what is happening to Russia, who can barely get the specialized parts and resources it needs to maintain its aging arsenal of tanks, missiles, and other weapons. It took close to a year for Western sanctions to show results, but it is happening. It has forced Russian leadership to look to Iran, North Korea, and even China for relief. It certainly makes Chinese leaders wonder if invading Taiwan would be worth the disastrous economic consequences if it were suddenly shut off from Western goods and resources, or sell its own wares in foreign markets, the bread and butter upon which it has built itself into a regional superpower. Any invasion is likely to cement sanctions in place for years, and China now has every indication that the West would be willing to sustain these for the long haul, even if it adversely affected their own economies. The invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call to the US and the rest of NATO. For 30 years, it felt confident that the threat of authoritarianism and conventional peer aggression were relics of the past. A false sense of security lulled the West into believing it could retrench its security commitments and focus inward on themselves. In the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, there were serious, high-level discussions regarding the United States' forward presence in Europe and how far it should go to underwrite European security. It has the most powerful military on Earth. It is the backbone of NATO. If the US had to fight alone, it could certainly defeat any other country in an equal fight. But Putin's invasion reminded American policymakers how valuable multinational security collaboration can be. It highlighted the pitfalls of drawing red lines in the sand and not being willing to back them up. Now, the US and its allies are clearer about how active they will be in supporting their allies and partners. Unfortunately for China, Taiwan is one such place, and it has Putin to thank for the reaffirmation of American political, economic, and military support for the island. Had Putin never invaded, it's fair to assume that the United States may have drifted into ambivalence. With each presidential term, costs of projecting preventative power into the Pacific would continue to mount, causing debate over whether it was all worth it. Who knows, over time the US may have actually withdrawn many of its forces and shuttered its overseas bases, opening a window for China's grey zone operations to come to full effect. Now, there's little chance China will get away with this type of behavior without serious repercussions. The US will keep a closer eye on China to ensure it doesn't try to mobilize an invasion force. If it does, it should take heed of one final lesson from Russia. If an invasion goes wrong, you can kiss your power and influence goodbye. Today, almost everyone across the globe besides Russia itself knows Putin's military is nowhere near as powerful as he made it out to be. Invading an independent, freedom-loving neighbor is a perfect way to turn the entire world against you. Failed invasions are tickets to infamy. They are permanent marks of discredit, disgrace, and disrepute. Russia has long since lost control of the narrative of benign liberation it touted as its primary aim. NATO has become more united and emboldened, and all from a failed invasion. If China launched its own invasion and failed, it would undoubtedly witness its hard-earned influence and prestige throughout East Asia and even beyond fade away. America's closest regional allies in the Indo-Pacific remain closely tied to China in some form or another, but if China invaded and embarked on a long, drawn-out war, it would see its regional influence shrink relative to its enemies. Just because a country is a major power does not mean the world can't live without it. Just ask Putin. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been an unmitigated disaster for China. The powerful Eurasian alliance it once hoped to forge with its Russian ally is now severely unbalanced. The world is a completely different place than it was a year ago. Just as the West has wised up to authoritarian threats, China has learned that an invasion would be met with stout Taiwanese resistance and long-term Western support. Power on paper does not guarantee success. But what do you think? Will China decide to invade Taiwan despite the obvious risks? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
The rise of an aggressive China under Xi Jinping has severely disrupted the post-Cold War international order. Xi aims for China to become the world's leading superpower by 2049. the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in China's Civil War. To achieve these goals, China has used its economic leverage to seduce or coerce other nations and multinational corporations to go along with its bidding. It has also expanded its military presence in the South China Sea and increased its saber-rattling against Taiwan, which it aims to incorporate back into the mainland's governance by 2049. China's behavior has caused great alarm among its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region, prompting the response of a new multilateral coalition, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But what is this organization, usually called the Quad? Why is it after China? And what are its intentions to counter China's behavior? The Quad had its beginnings in December 2004, in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the 29th, then-President George W. Bush announced that the United States would partner with a regional core group of India, Japan, and Australia to coordinate relief efforts. The effort gave the group its first experience of conducting maritime operations together. The Quad got renewed impetus in the initial rise of Shinzo Abe as the Japanese Prime Minister. When campaigning for office in 2006, Abe described his vision of an arc of freedom and prosperity. The arc would be a grouping of like-minded states in the region making a collective effort to promote liberal values like free markets and the rule of law. In December 2006, then Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh announced his country's accession to the dialogue. When 2007 began, then American Vice President Dick Cheney signaled American interest and convinced then Australian Prime Minister John Howard to cooperate as well. Abe traveled to India that April, which paved the way for the Quad's first senior-level meeting the following month. The navies of the four countries then cooperated in the second Exercise Malabar alongside the Singaporean Navy. Despite this promising start, the Quad experienced troubles shortly thereafter. China always viewed it as a threat. At that time, it was not yet apparent that China would attempt to change the international status quo by coercive methods. There were still great hopes that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization in the country. Important potential partner countries like South Korea were therefore reluctant to join the Quad and risk alienating China. Meanwhile, India, traditionally a non-aligned country, saw public protests over its participation in the Malabar exercise. China's diplomatic efforts helped to lead to the unraveling of the Quad and Shinzo Abe's fall from power in September 2007, depriving it of its leading advocate. By the beginning of 2008, the Quad had collapsed. A decade later, things had changed dramatically. China became more authoritarian at home and confrontational abroad under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012. At the same time, Shinzo Abe returned to power in Japan, and just one day after his second premiership began, he signaled his geopolitical intentions. Peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Japan, as one of the oldest seafaring democracies in Asia, should play a greater role, alongside Australia, India, and the US, in preserving the common good in both regions. This statement was the prototype of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific (FOIP) strategy. Abe's policy was to insert a reinvigorated Japanese military into traditional bilateral and trilateral exercises between the United States, India, and Australia. For example, the United States and India continued to do their traditional bilateral Malabar naval exercises, but Japan became a permanent party to these in 2015. As Abe worked to slowly reconstruct the Quad, China became more confrontational with all of its participating countries. Disputes ratcheted up between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands, which the former administers but the latter claims as its territory. India and China had numerous border standoffs. Australian politicians were found to have accepted money from China-aligned organizations and individuals, which helped to lead new foreign interference laws in that country in 2018. The rise of Donald Trump to the White House in 2016 also spurred the reformation of the Quad. Trump had long been of the belief that China was the greatest threat to the United States, which made him agreeable to the idea of the Quad. An October 2017 meeting between then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono resulted in them proposing a resumption of the full Quad. The following month at the ASEAN conference in Manila, representatives from the four countries met on the margins to discuss the tense situation in the Indo-Pacific region. All four affirmed their support for the FOIP concept. Quadrilateral meetings on the issue have continued ever since. In the 2000s, after its revival, China has often complained that the Quad is an attempt to create an Asian NATO to contain it. However, the Quad is not a formal alliance, unlike NATO. It's rather an informal grouping of countries. In a statement that laid out the spirit of the Quad, in 2021, the group's leaders said, "We bring diverse perspectives and are united in a shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion." While not declaring a formal alliance, the statement left little room for doubt that China was the main source of concern among the Quad's members. As such, the Quad is first and foremost a security cooperative, as its proper name suggests. Joint security cooperation has been an integral feature of the Quad since its refounding. Australia was added to the annual Malabar exercises in 2020 and has repeated its presence there since. Quad countries are also increasing their bilateral and trilateral security ties. Japan and India engage in regular JIMEX exercises in the North Arabian Sea, while India and Australia have their bilateral OSINDEX exercise. All Quad countries are participants in the multilateral Rim of Pacific (RIMPAC) exercises. The United States, which is a long-time ally of both Japan and Australia, conducts regular military cross-training with both of those countries. Japan's goals for the Quad are relatively simple. Ensure that China does not become the hegemon of Asia. If such a thing were to happen, its trade would be imperiled. Roughly 40% of Japan's imports come through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, and as a resource-poor nation, it needs those imports for its economic survival. Unfortunately for Tokyo, China has increasingly militarized and monopolized the area since 2012. If China is not deterred from further aggression, Beijing will be in a position to dictate the trade of the region, forcing Japan into a terrible geopolitical position. If China gets too powerful, Japan may also lose control of the Senkaku Islands, just as the Philippines lost control of the Scarborough Shoal. The alliance with the United States has traditionally been, and remains, the foundation of Japan's national security. But Australia and India are valuable partners that it cannot do without in light of the higher stakes. Japan has therefore deepened its security ties with Australia. The two countries made a reciprocal forces agreement to formalize procedures for overseas troop deployments. In 2023, Japan announced it would be stationing troops in Australia, which is a deviation from decades of traditional military policy in Tokyo. Japan has also made an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with India, along with defense equipment, technology, and intelligence sharing agreements. For Australia, the Quad is a reinforcement and leveling up of its traditional diplomatic relationships. For example, Australia has long been a partner in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance with the United States. Australia's military cooperation with Japan has increased, and in June 2020, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison signaled a mutual logistics sharing agreement with India, while announcing that their bilateral institutions would now be considered as a comprehensive strategic partnership. Moreover, China's recent security pact with the Solomon Islands, which sit to the northeast of Australia, threatens its trade. Australia needs a counterweight, which it sees the Quad as being. The Quad has also allowed Australia to become more militarily capable, as the AUKUS pact with the United States and the United Kingdom will give it nuclear submarines, which Beijing loudly complained about. For India, the Quad represents a departure from its traditional policy of strategic autonomy in foreign affairs. Unlike the other three Quad members, it does not have experience participating in America's system of military alliances. Still, India needs partners, if not allies, to prevent China from getting too powerful. India and China share a disputed border. China's navy has increased its presence in India's backyard. China is also an important partner for India's traditional enemy, Pakistan. China's economic partnerships with India's neighbors through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Comprehensive Economic Partnership threaten to isolate India from the region. In light of this reality, India has had little choice but to increase its ties with the United States. New Delhi has increased its security ties with Washington through military purchases that include anti-submarine platforms and heavy-lift aircraft. India has also signed logistics and base access agreements with Australia and Japan. For the United States, keeping China's power in check and preventing it from becoming a regional hegemon is now the top foreign policy priority. For Washington, the Quad is a valuable institution to assist America in achieving this goal. The United States has global commitments, which Russia's invasion of Ukraine made all too clear. In a direct confrontation between the United States and China, the latter would be able to concentrate all of its resources in the conflict, while America's forces would be divided. Washington has long sought to put a greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, but despite this being a rare area of bipartisan consensus, it's never been able to do so to the extent that it has wanted. NATO's free rider problem and Middle Eastern flare-ups are only two examples of things which divide the attention of the United States and force it to spread its resources more thinly. The Quad therefore is a means for Washington to both put greater emphasis on the strategic region and build up forces and relationships to assist in containing Beijing's ambitions. Through the security cooperation of the Quad, the United States is steadily improving the military readiness of Japan, India, and Australia. The Quad also allows for the rapid cooperation of America's partners to threaten Chinese shipping. For example, India can easily threaten to choke Chinese shipping off from the Strait of Malacca, while Japan can do the same for the Strait of Miyako. As China relies heavily on foreign food and fuel imports, this is an important measure of geostrategic leverage to force China to change its behavior. America's Quad partners are strategically positioned to the east, west, and south of the First Island chain, multiplying the United States' ability to contain China's ambitions in the region. For these reasons, China was again quick to protest the Quad and denounce it as a method of containment, but the cooperating countries have cared far less about Beijing's protests in this second go of the security partnership. China's actions since the first incarnation of the Quad fell apart had alienated its neighbors in the region, as well as the United States. China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic only strengthened the conviction that China was a bad actor on the world stage. 2020 would be an important year in defining the Quad's purpose and giving it staying power. Shortly after the pandemic began, China got into a diplomatic row with Australia over the latter's insistence on an independent inquiry into its origins. China responded to these calls by imposing punitive tariffs on many Australian exports. Meanwhile, the border dispute between China and India saw an armed confrontation in June 2020, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian troops and 4 Chinese soldiers. The events of 2021 spurred the Quad to expand its purview. Despite the chaotic presidential election in the United States, Donald Trump's successor, Joe Biden, largely continued his administration's policies regarding China, including with the Quad. However, Biden soon signaled his intentions on expanding the Quad beyond a coalition to contain China. It was the first summit of Joe Biden's presidency, indicating the importance of this multilateral relationship to the new administration's foreign policy agenda. Under Joe Biden, the Quad has evolved beyond a purely military or security partnership. It has also been involved in economic and diplomatic aid. For example, the group's first summit, which took place in March 2021, outlined its plans to counter the COVID-19 pandemic by distributing 1 billion doses of the single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine to low- and middle-income countries in Southeast Asia by the end of 2022. The United States would finance the measure, Japan and India would manufacture the vaccines, and Australia would take the lead in distributing the shots and getting them into arms. It was the start of a broader purpose for the Quad, to tackle other global challenges such as cybercrimes, terrorism, and climate change. Although this would seem irrelevant as a strategic counter to China, it's not. China has sought to expand its influence through economic and diplomatic partnerships equally as much as it has attempted to with its military buildup. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of Xi Jinping's most important strategic initiatives, which is why it's not surprising that infrastructure has also been on the Quad's agenda. At the first in-person Quad summit in September 2021, the leaders announced that high-standards infrastructure would be a priority for the partnership. This announcement was an evolution of the trilateral infrastructure partnership already in place between the United States, Japan, and Australia. In May 2022, the Quad leaders announced the Quad Infrastructure Coordination Group, which would focus on transportation, digital connectivity, clean energy, and climate resilience. The statement released by the Biden White House said that the heads of the Quad's respective national development financing agencies had met in Tokyo to discuss the infrastructure financing gap in the region, a veiled shot at the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement stated that these agencies would cooperate with each other and the private sector to support investments in critical infrastructure. The same White House press release also announced that space and emerging technologies would continue to be a focus for the Quad. The subjects range from 5G supplier diversification to space observation, satellite data sharing, and disaster response and relief for the Indo-Pacific region. In space, the Quad's focus is on observation and data exchanges for the moment, but the release also mentioned a focus on consulting on norms and guidelines. However, with China testing hypersonic glide vehicles, it seems likely that the Quad's security relationship will eventually expand to space. The Quad aims to foster ties between the people of respective member states as well. At their 2021 summit, the leaders announced the Quad Fellowship, which will sponsor 100 students per year, 25 from each country, to pursue STEM graduate degrees at elite universities in the United States, with the cooperation of the private sector. While the dialogue is currently limited to 4 members, there have been discussions about expanding the Quad. Quad Plus meetings have included South Korea, New Zealand, and even Vietnam. South Korea has expressed interest in joining the organization formally, although this has not happened yet. Why? While tensions between the two have lessened since the election of Yoon Suk-yeol to the South Korean presidency in 2022, Seoul and Tokyo have long had frosty relations over historical, economic, and security issues. There is no guarantee that the gradual thawing in relations between South Korea and Japan will continue. Therefore, the Biden administration seems worried that a renewed stress between the two would undermine the Quad's cohesion, should South Korea formally join it. It's also arguable that formally including other countries in the core Quad would undermine the group's cohesion. Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. The current grouping allows rapid communication and decision-making among its members, and all 4 seem to want to keep it that way. On the other hand, the Quad cannot afford to remain too insular. Other like-minded countries, including countries in Europe, are expanding their Indo-Pacific strategies and their presence in the area. If the 4 Quad members do not engage in meaningful coordination with these efforts, they risk duplicating or undercutting each other's efforts in the region, according to a report written by Garima Mohan and Christy Govella for the German Marshall Fund, a security and democracy-focused think tank headquartered in Washington. Furthermore, to build a positive alternative to China's vision for the Indo-Pacific region that goes beyond the security sphere, the Quad will need to develop a reputation of delivering on its many pledges. Unfortunately for the Quad, there are already reasons to believe that it will not be able to do so. By May 2022, it was clear that the vaccine partnership had underperformed the lofty goals set for it. Delivery of the shots only began in early 2022, when the pandemic was already winding down. By May, the Quad had delivered less than half the vaccine doses it promised thanks to time, circumstances such as India's COVID-19 outbreak in the spring of 2021, and controversy over the selected Johnson & Johnson vaccine. By September 22, it became clear that the goal would not be met, and the Quad pivoted away from the vaccine pledge. Instead, the Quad's policy would shift to preparing for future emergencies, such as strengthening global healthcare architecture and prevention of future pandemics. The Quad has not always been smooth sailing in other ways too. The 4 members have been at odds at times. Unlike the other 3 Quad members, India has been far more ambiguous in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's purchased Russian energy at an increased rate, helping to keep Moscow's economy afloat. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also come under international controversy for his government's crackdown on the country's Muslim population in the Indian-controlled portion of the disputed Kashmir region. As the Quad pledges to be a bulwark of liberal values, some of Modi's policies may undermine its humanitarian image. However, these controversies have tended to take secondary status in the Quad, which remains a security-first grouping. In international relations, security considerations will always take priority over economic and ideological considerations. And with the Quad now being broadly popular among the electorates of all 4 member states, it's an institution with staying power, unlike the way it was the first time round. For all 4 members of the Quad, the security considerations are clear. China under Xi Jinping has inserted itself at the center of many of the world's critical supply chains, built up its armed forces, saber-rattled against its neighbors, expanded its influence over other nations with its Belt and Road infrastructure projects, and become more authoritarian. Preventing China from becoming strong enough to dictate terms in the region is a matter of survival for India, Australia, and Japan, and necessary if the United States wishes to remain the world's leading nation. The Quad may not be an Asian NATO, but its arrival has made many experts conclude that there is a new Cold War going on in the Indo-Pacific region. As NATO proved so important in containing the Soviet Union in the First Cold War, the Quad's advocates seek for it to do the same to China now. But what do you think about the Quad? What will its future be, and how will it shape the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The People's Republic of China has big plans. By 2049, it aims to displace the United States as the world's most powerful country, completing its 180-degree turnaround from an impoverished colossus suffering under a supposed century of humiliation. It is a poetic goal, fit for an epic story. There's a fundamental flaw in the story though, China's own geography, which effectively aids the United States' strategy to contain its ambitions. In this video, we'll explore the containment strategy and China's attempts to get around it. In the Cold War, the United States and its allies faced a big problem, literally. This was the European plain, which begins at the Bay of Biscay in France and extends for thousands of miles all the way to the Ural Mountains. The further east you go, the broader the plain gets. With the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies extending from the Urals all the way to central Germany, the United States and NATO's were outnumbered and forced onto a narrow front. There, the communist powers could concentrate all of their forces in an offensive drive to the west. For Washington, this geostrategic disadvantage meant that the only seemingly feasible means of containing communism in Europe was through nuclear deterrence. It was not the case in Asia. When the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949, the United States came up with its island chain strategy to keep the People's Republic and its Soviet ally bottled up in the Eurasian landmass. The strategy, formalized in 1951, was largely the brainchild of John Foster Dulles, then an advisor to President Truman and later Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. Originally, the island chain strategy comprised 3 strings, essentially 3 lines of defense against communism in the Pacific. These lines remain in place today. The first island chain stretches from the Japanese archipelago down to Taiwan, through the Philippines, and finally into the Indonesian archipelago, stopping at the Strait of Malacca. The second island chain also starts from Japan, where it moves through its Bonin Islands, past the Japanese-governed Volcano Islands in Micronesia, past the Mariana Islands like Guam, through the Western Caroline Islands like Yap and Palau, and ends in Western New Guinea. Finally, in the classical strategy, there was the third island chain. This line starts at the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and stretches through the vast center of the Pacific Ocean, through Hawaii, American Samoa, Fiji, and ends in New Zealand. In more recent times, as China's power has grown and as Beijing has displayed its ambitions for the Indian Ocean and Africa, some American national security experts have added 4th and 5th island chains to their planning. The 4th island chain moves southward from Pakistan through the Laskadweep Islands and the Maldives westward of the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota, which is controlled by China through its Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), and the important US-UK military base of Diego Garcia. The 5th island chain, meanwhile, starts with the United States Camp Lemonnier base in Djibouti on the Gulf of Aden and hugs the African coastline. Although the 4th and 5th island chains have not been formally codified into American national security strategy, most experts have informally accepted them as being part of the United States' overall plan of containment. The first island chain was and remains the most important part of Washington's containment strategy. It's the shortest, easiest to defend, and encompasses a significant portion of the world's population and economic activity, making it clearly more important than the other island chains. For China to become anything more than a regional land power, it must first break the containment of the first island chain. Unfortunately for Beijing, this presents numerous challenges. China is a nation that heavily depends on food and energy imports, much of which goes through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, which are contained within the first island chain. China's economy also depends on its exports, which also go through these maritime trade routes. Any disruption to these trade routes in either form would prove devastating for the Chinese economy, which is already slowing down after decades of breakneck growth. To make matters worse for Beijing, the first island chain presents a series of natural choke points that the United States and its allies could use to cut that shipping off. These include the Straits of Malacca, Luzon, and Miyako. For China, being able to get around these choke points is an item of top priority. It has approached the problem from 2 directions. First, it's invested a large portion of the wealth of its economic rise into a hefty military buildup, especially its naval and air forces. China now has the world's largest navy by sheer number of vessels, although not by tonnage, and this marks a key disadvantage. Despite its numbers, China's People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, is still not capable of surviving a direct confrontation with the United States Navy. However, Beijing understands its military disadvantage and has adapted to the situation with a strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD. This strategy is meant to make it too costly for the United States to project power into the First Island chain, should conflict break out. In the event of a confrontation, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles ready to destroy American ships and bases in the region. As part of this strategy, China has built and militarized artificial islands in the disputed waters of the South China Sea. Some of these, such as Mischief Reef, host ship-killing missiles and runways for fighter jets and bombers. If China cannot yet kick the United States out of the First Island chain, it's raised the cost of projecting power into the area significantly, and might reasonably hope to make sustained forward presence there politically untenable in the war-weary American homeland. This is the tyranny of distance. The United States is adapting to China's A2AD strategy, though, which makes it imperfect for Beijing's ambitions. In early 2021, the United States made plans to establish a string of precision strike missiles along the First Island chain as part of a $27.4 billion military package centering on the Indo-Pacific theater over the following 6 years. The Precision Strike Missile is a land-based ballistic missile with a range between 60 and 500 kilometers, which can be launched from mobile rocket artillery platforms like HIMARS, making this weapon durable and harder for China to remove from the board with missile attacks. The Precision Strike Missile is the coming replacement for ATACMS and has recently entered service in a limited capacity. The US Army announced it had received its first batch of these missiles on December 8, 2023. Stationing these weapons along the First Island chain is, for Washington, a vital part of re-establishing a conventional deterrence that it acknowledges has eroded in recent years. Another of the most important adaptations for Washington to defend the First Island chain is through the presence of new bases in the Philippines, which began in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, and has expanded in 2023. Presumably, some of the precision strike missiles slated for delivery to the theater will be placed in these bases. China had once hoped to court the Philippines into its orbit, despite the dispute in the South China Sea, under the friendly Rodrigo Duterte presidency. As part of this effort, China was supposed to invest $24 billion in BRI-related projects. Securing investment and strategic infrastructure in the Philippines would have been very valuable to Beijing, as it would have helped to break China's containment in the First Island chain. However, the BRI investments never truly panned out, and Duterte's successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., withdrew from the project in late 2023. The end result? The United States has increased its presence in the Philippines, while China remains shut out. The crown jewel in China's ambition to break out of the First Island chain is a conquest of Taiwan, which the People's Republic has always considered a rogue province left over from the Civil War and century of humiliation. As Taiwan sits at the center of the First Island chain, its importance was recognized as soon as the Chinese Communist Party came to power. As early as the 1950s, the United States committed to keeping the communists out of Taiwan. When the mainland bombed the outlying Kinmen and Matsu Islands where Taiwanese troops were stationed and set off the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the United States Congress and the Eisenhower administration made it clear that they would use military force to destroy a Chinese invasion. Dulles even publicly threatened a nuclear attack on the Chinese mainland if the communists attempted to take the island. China had no choice but to back down, a dynamic that has repeated since then. China's more recent military buildup has increased the importance of Taiwan. For the first time, American national security officials are not entirely confident that the United States military can successfully defend the island, at least not without tremendous cost that the American public might be reluctant to bear. However, the United States continues to arm Taiwan through the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. With this help, Taiwan has adopted what it calls a porcupine strategy, which aims to make the cost of an invasion as bloody as possible for Beijing. In a series of war games from January 2023, the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that out of 24 scenarios, China succeeded in an invasion twice, but it only did so when the United States did not intervene or when Japan did not allow it to use the bases in its territory. Even when China did succeed in conquering the island, it came at a cost of 70,000 casualties and 23,000 deaths. In a more realistic scenario, the costs would be far greater. Again, bad news for Beijing. The present situation suggests that for China, attempting to break out of the First Island chain by military means is still too difficult or costly. However, many experts are still worried. If China were to break the containment of the first island chain, the line would become longer and much more difficult to defend, even if it's closer to the American homeland. For example, the United States Air Force would have a harder time projecting power, as refueling operations would need to move north to keep tankers out of range of China's fighters. The United States Navy would lose command of the first island chain's choke points and would be more vulnerable to a Chinese missile threat that would extend hundreds of miles further east. For these reasons, the United States has invested more heavily in the second island chain in recent years to shore up the region's defenses. This comes in response to China's moves. For example, China has tried to expand its BRI into Micronesia. This is part of its strategy toward deeper political and economic integration in pursuit of its ultimate goal, which is to build bases in the second island chain that will allow it to project military power there. However, China's efforts in the area have met controversy. 2 months before leaving office in May 2023, former Micronesian President David Penuelo claimed that China had tried to threaten, bribe, and otherwise pressure his country's officials to go along with its strategic goals. So far, though, China has had no luck in building a base in the second island chain. Unfortunately for Beijing, the United States also has deep ties to the region. It already has unlimited military access rights to Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. These rights are part of a pact between Washington and the Freely Associated States (FAS) of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. This military access is expanding its infrastructure too, to make it more robust. In the summer of 2021, the United States and Micronesia agreed to build a new base there to allow a more permanent American military presence. So far, because of its territory in the area and the deep ties between Washington and the FAS, the United States has largely kept China at bay in the second island chain, and it's being assisted by Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan in doing so. All of these countries understand that allowing China to build a presence in the second island chain would make them more vulnerable. China has had more success in the third island chain. The third island chain is important because it sits on the lines of travel and commerce between the United States and Australia. In World War II, the Japanese Empire attempted to disrupt this line. In the 21st century, China has increased its investments in the area, potentially hoping to do the same thing the Japanese tried to do. As part of this effort, China has increased its ties with the Solomon Islands and Kiribati. In the Solomons, China has taken advantage of increasing estrangement between that country and Australia. When the anti-Australia Manasseh Sogavare returned to power as Prime Minister in 2019, Beijing seized on the opportunity. The Solomons withdrew its recognition of Taiwan that year and signed a memorandum of understanding that permits China to deploy its police forces to deal with internal unrest. The MOU also allows for some Chinese military presence. Although it does not permit the creation of a base, it allows for some rotational basing of Chinese military personnel. The expansion of China's security presence in the Solomon Islands is a direct threat to Australia, and it worries that country and its allies. Kiribati has also seen an increased Chinese presence. It too ended its recognition of Taiwan in favor of the mainland in 2019. In 2021, it signed on to a Chinese loan to lengthen an airstrip on the island of Canton. If this project is completed, China will have its easternmost facility. Although this will not be a full-blown Air Force base, it would give China an increased ability to conduct surveillance on the United States in the third island chain. Despite its success in the third island chain, however, Beijing has also encountered problems. The United States and Australia retain a big presence in the region. Tuvalu rejected China's attempts at influence. Meanwhile, China greatly desired to increase its presence in Papua New Guinea, which sits just north of Australia. China had hoped to incorporate Papua New Guinea into its infrastructure financing and renovate a port there that could be turned into an ideal base for the PLAN. Instead, Papua New Guinea offered the facility to the United States and Australia in a joint arrangement. This base sits just outside the reach of China's missiles. Overall, despite its recent successes there, the balance of power in the third island chain still favors the United States. The fourth island chain is a relatively new concept in American national security circles, but China's interest in the Indian Ocean has brought it to prominence. With China relatively contained within the first three island chains in the Western Pacific, it sought alternatives to access the world's waterways. While the waters off the Chinese mainland are surrounded by hostile islands, the Indian Ocean is a much more open place. China has partially succeeded in establishing footholds along the fourth island chain, Investments in Pakistan have been one of the cornerstones of China's BRI. These investments, called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC), center on the port of Gwadar, which gives China direct access to the Indian Ocean. China has increased this access further with its BRI investments in Sri Lanka, which has included a Chinese takeover of the Hambantota port with a lease of 99 years. China gained control of this port after the initial investment in the infrastructure proved unprofitable and the Sri Lankans were unable to pay the debt they had accrued. This BRI-related infrastructure is important and could signal Beijing's military intentions in the Fourth Island chain. For example, in August 2022, a Chinese ship arrived in Hambantota. Beijing called this a survey ship. However, the ship had also been used for military purposes, tracking satellites and missiles. Western and Indian national security experts were alarmed at its appearance. Chinese officials in the area gave it a warm welcome, while senior Sri Lankan officials were not present at the ceremony. The arrival of this ship was seen as a litmus test of how far China plans to militarize the BRI investments in these areas. However, China's strategy in the Fourth Island chain has faced some problems as well. BRI projects in Pakistan have faced financial difficulties and even terrorist attacks, which have forced them to scale back. The investment in Sri Lanka is more successful from a strategic, if not an economic perspective. There's a big obstacle in the Fourth Island chain even if the BRI-related projects pan out and China can find a way to militarize the area, the Diego Garcia Naval Base to the south. The Diego Garcia Base allows the United States Navy and Air Force to rapidly project power into some of the most strategic areas in the world, like the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea. The advantage Diego Garcia gives the United States was punctuated in the summer of 2020, when 3 nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bombers arrived at the base. Diego Garcia is in fact only one of a select few bases equipped to handle the B-2, which requires careful climate-controlled hangars known as B-2 shelter systems. That such infrastructure will be built there signals how important this base is to Washington. Despite international controversy that China has understandably helped to fuel, it has no intentions of abandoning the base anytime soon. For China, having the infrastructure and the concentrated force required to overcome the United States military presence at Diego Garcia is a difficult challenge. Thus far, the United States maintains superiority in the Fourth Island chain and can disrupt China's strategy there. Finally, there is the Fifth Island chain. This one is unique as it features China's only actual overseas military base, the People's Liberation Army Support Base in Djibouti, which opened in 2017. The base is close to the United States Camp Lemonnier in the same country. Camp Lemonnier is closer to the coast than China's base is, however, which allows the United States greater leeway in projecting power into the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. As of now, the Fourth and especially Fifth Island chains are secondary theaters in the great power competition between the United States and China. However, they are an area of burgeoning importance. The moves China makes with its BRI investments in places like Sri Lanka will dictate how they evolve. Unsurprisingly, with all of these maritime disadvantages, China has had to find other ways to try and bypass its containment within the successive island chains. This is why the BRI has prioritized overland infrastructure investments and other beneficial arrangements across the Eurasian landmass, spanning from China to Europe. For example, China has increasingly imported Russian energy through overland pipelines since the war in Ukraine began, protecting its energy supply from the US Navy's patrolling in the First Island chain. However, with the difficulties that the BRI has faced, this has not proven to be a substitute for the true power projection that the successive island chains prevent China from achieving. Becoming a world superpower often requires favorable geography. The United States had such a geographical advantage from its inception. With weak neighbors and 2 vast oceans separating it from peer competitors, it avoided damage and disruption, and no one was in position to bottle up its trade or naval buildup. Geography has not been so kind to China. Surrounded as it is by hostile powers, China must come up with alternatives to project its power, but so far these have not proven satisfactory. Beijing may have plans to be the world superpower by 2049, but it would hardly be the first time that an authoritarian power could not deliver on its boasts. If China does not find a way around this problem, Xi Jinping's China dream will never come true. But what do you think? Will China be able to effectively break its containment within the island chains? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. China's plan to invade the relatively small yet globally significant island of Taiwan may be hitting a major roadblock. The Philippines, backed by the US, could influence China's invasion plans in a major China-Taiwan conflict. But what is it about the Philippines that makes them play such a pivotal role in this scenario? In the year 2023, Taiwan became the most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth. This de facto independent island nation 110 miles off the coast of the Chinese mainland sits at the center of the world's economic and geopolitical fault lines. Since it came to power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, a relic left over from its long civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed. This was the period between 1839 and 1949, where China repeatedly found itself invaded, defeated, occupied, and partitioned by foreign powers. Taiwan's self-governing status is a reminder to the Chinese leadership of those times, and reunifying it with the mainland is one of the most important objectives for China's authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, who hopes that the process will be completed by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's ascendancy to power. There are many obstacles to this plan, but one of them is not so often cited: the Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines, its tense relationship with China, and how this nation threatens Beijing's grandest foreign policy ambition. Taiwan is important to the Chinese leadership not just for historical reasons, but because of its economic and geostrategic position. Economically, Taiwan hosts the world's most advanced semiconductor industry through the dominance of one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In 2021, Taiwan had 63% of the world's semiconductor market share, with 54% of the world total being through TSMC alone. These chips are at the heart of the world's digital economy and power everything from computers to the brake sensors in cars. For China, gaining control of this industry would be very desirable. Placing itself at the heart of the globe's high-technology supply chain has been a major priority for its geopolitical strategy, as seen in its Made in China 2025 plan. If the semiconductor shortage of the past few years made things more expensive, Beijing getting to dictate the supply chain of these vital components would increase the price tag of almost everything much further. Geopolitically, Taiwan also sits at the center of the first island chain, the series of islands that span from Japan to Indonesia. These islands act as a natural obstacle to China's expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Restoring Taiwan to Beijing's rule would break this chain and allow China to freely access the world's oceans without having to go through the choke points that the first island chain presents, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Miyako Strait. Controlling these choke points is one of the United States Navy's principal strategies for containing Chinese military expansion. If China were to take Taiwan, however, it would have the land and ports it needs to bypass those choke points, making containment much more difficult, if not impossible. The United States is Taiwan's most important potential ally. Officially, America treats Taiwan with a doctrine of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that it would come to the island's defense if it were to be invaded. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, it has long sold sophisticated weapons to the island nation to deter such an invasion from happening. With this equipment, Taiwan has pursued what it calls a porcupine strategy, fortifying itself as heavily as possible and building offensive assets to deal damage to the Chinese mainland, all to increase the costs China would incur for an invasion and hold out as long as it can while it awaits the aid of its allies. Japan would also play an important role in the defense of Taiwan. In December 2021, the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the United States and Japan would not be able to stand idly by if Taiwan were attacked. In 2022, only a few months before his shocking assassination, he urged the United States to drop strategic ambiguity and affirmatively say it would defend Taiwan. A Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, he said, because China establishing air superiority around Taiwan would cover Japanese airspace. A takeover of Taiwan would also allow China to threaten Japanese shipping even more than it does today with its militarization of the South China Sea. Japan is a resource-poor nation and must import raw materials and commodities to survive. It cannot allow China to dictate what goes on in the region's shipping lanes. However, for all the talk about Japan and its role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, far fewer people talk about the role the Philippines would play in such a scenario. Thanks to a renewed agreement with the United States, this is starting to change.
and Taiwan may soon be able to count on the aid of the Philippines as it stares down the colossus across the strait. The Philippines, though much smaller than the United States and Japan, also has a keen interest in seeing that Taiwan does not become subject to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Philippines has now become a major player in the dispute over Taiwan. The entrance of the Philippines into the Taiwan question is a natural consequence of the diplomatic and military rivalry between it and China, which has occurred in the last decade. The Philippines and China have long had a bitter dispute over the waters of the South China Sea. In 2012, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a rock with valuable fishing sites and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was the start of a conflict between China and the Philippines over several rocks and island chains in the South China Sea. Other points of contention between the two nations include Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands, all of which China went on to occupy and fortify. The Philippines brought a suit in international court, and in 2016, a tribunal in The Hague ruled that all of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, based on a 9-dash line map drawn in the late 1940s, had no legal basis. Still, China ignored the ruling and occupies these rocks and islands to this day. China's aggressive policy in the area has naturally alienated the Philippines, which is a long-time ally of the United States. The United States has had bases throughout the Philippines since the Spanish-American War of 1898, but its presence is now starting to expand much more. The Filipino military is not a formidable fighting force, meaning that China has mostly been able to get its way in its disputes with the Philippines, despite the international tribunals ruling against it. The Philippines has an active army of about 100,000 active duty personnel, a navy with only a few vessels more fit for fighting than patrol boats, and about 25 combat aircraft. This means that militarily, the Philippines would contribute little to the defense of Taiwan, at least for now. However, the Philippines does have two advantages: its geographical position and its alliance with the United States, which it has now begun to ramp up ties with again after a period of frostier relations. In 2014, as the South China Sea dispute began to ramp up, the United States and the Philippines signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Under the terms of the EDCA, the United States would be able to expand its military presence in the Philippines, although the 2014 document did not specifically state where it would do this. Rather, the document only affirmed the principle that the armed forces of the Philippines would provide new locations for the United States Armed Forces. In 2016, 5 such locations were formally announced. These were, from north to south, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Besa Air Base in Pampanga, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. Of the 2016 locations, Antonio Bautista Air Base was the most important, as it was close to the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. However, as China's military buildup in the region has only grown since 2016, the United States and Philippines announced plans to further accelerate the EDCA in February 2023. In April, the Pentagon announced the creation of 4 new EDCA bases. These are Naval Base Camilo Osayas in Santa Ana, Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela, Balabac Island in Palawan, and Laulo Airport in Cagayan. Not coincidentally, 3 of these 4 locations are in the northern Philippines, which makes the intentions of that expansion clear. The new bases are to help deter a potential invasion of Taiwan by allowing the United States to more easily project power into a critical area, the Luzon Strait. The Luzon Strait is one of the first island chain's strategic choke points. It is a 160-mile gap of water between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island, Mavulis, is even closer, at only 118 miles away from the world's most disputed hotspot. Here is where we see the role that the Philippines would play in the defense of the world's most hotly contested island. In the first place, the bases give the United States and its regional allies additional options to choke off shipping to China. As China is heavily dependent on foreign food and energy imports, this is something that the country's leadership will need to take seriously and helps aid the process of deterrence. Geographically, the bases strengthen a potential new front to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan if deterrence fails and hostilities actually become a reality. In the necessary amphibious operation, China would now likely be facing a pincer movement of forces moving south from Japan and north from the Philippines, adding to the already immense difficulty of pulling off a successful waterborne maneuver and establishing a beachhead across the Strait of Taiwan. An amphibious invasion is hard enough. An amphibious invasion that would need to fend off American and Allied forces on two sides, that would be almost impossible, especially with a lack of surprise on the invaders' side. The bases also better prepare the United States and its other allies in the region, such as its Quad partners Japan and Australia, for war. Their locations make them ideal places to stage military exercises simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Although there is no true substitute for actual combat operations, the better prepared military force will usually get the better of an engagement, something the Chinese brass should know well, since the principle goes all the way back to Sun Tzu. The new bases in the Philippines certainly increase the preparation the United States and its allies can make for a coming invasion. The renewed military partnership between the United States and the Philippines also offers the prospect of improving that country's military readiness as well, which, as we have seen, is badly needed. As China's policy in the region has routinely seen the Philippines bullied, it is likely that policymakers in Manila will want to take advantage of the opportunity that the new bases provide. Indeed, the United States and the Philippines have already conducted drills in the Luzon Strait, which will lead to improved Filipino readiness in the long run. Someday soon, the Philippines could join joint exercises not only with the United States, but with its partners in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Japan, Australia, and possibly even India. The new bases in the Philippines also help to reduce one of China's major advantages, which had been eroding the United States' share of the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Namely, the bases help to mitigate the tyranny of distance. This term describes the disadvantage the United States would face by fighting thousands of miles away from its homeland. It would need to ship troops, supplies, and other essentials over those thousands of miles of ocean, where China's troops and supplies would only need to travel a little bit from their homeland. The vast distance also has a negative effect on morale at the home front, because it makes Americans wonder what the war is really about. This was a big factor in contributing to the political controversies in America's interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, and it is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the country's history. With China's development of anti-access area denial (A2AD) capabilities, the tyranny of distance has magnified. The long American supply lines would make ripe targets for China's A2AD strategy. But the bases in the Philippines give the United States more options. It can now position many more assets close to the area where the fighting over Taiwan would be taking place, making China's A2AD harder to carry out. For example, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that threatens all of America's bases in the region. But the more targets there are to hit, and the more air defense systems get concentrated along the bases, the faster China's missile depletion becomes. Some of the missiles will hit, but the bases in the Philippines mean that now China has more targets to hit and more air defense systems to deal with. The bases in the Philippines ultimately mean the attrition math will shift more in favor of the United States and its allies, even though they would still take terrible damage in an all-out Chinese missile attack. Still, surviving assets can more confidently be brought forward to act when the reign of missiles ends. In this way, the new bases in the Philippines are in line with the United States' third offset strategy, which it codified in the mid-2010s. Meanwhile, the new base means that the United States will be able to position more assets that can hit the Chinese mainland too, further undermining China's A2AD strategy and increasing the costs of a conflict exponentially and further aiding deterrence. The agreement with the Philippines, however, prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in the bases. So the EDCA is not a nuclear umbrella type of agreement. That is one of the few items of solace for the Chinese leadership. For the Philippines, the renewal and expansion of the EDCA marks a return to its traditional close relationship with the United States. Despite the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, flirted with forging closer relations with China in order to reduce the country's dependence on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has proven more traditional in pursuing the Philippines' alliance with the United States. The new base also includes an investment worth over $82 million for infrastructure and access to resources for those bases. This investment will be a good source of jobs for local Filipino residents, meaning that they aid the United States not only in its projection of military power, but economic influence. Therefore, aside from the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, the bases also affect one of the cornerstones of Chinese policy: economic coercion. China has long used its financial and industrial power to exert leverage over the domestic politics of other nations.
We have even witnessed this in action in the United States, with certain Hollywood filmmakers carefully curating their content to not offend Chinese sensibilities, and the 2019 controversy in the NBA about the fate of Hong Kong, which was erupting with protests at the time. The effects are far more profound elsewhere. For example, China has used its economic leverage over many Muslim-majority nations to buy their silence regarding the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in its western Xinjiang province, which the United States State Department, the British Parliament, and several other governments around the world have formally classified as genocide. China's infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, among other projects, have also given it leverage over countries receiving the funds. Although the Philippines is technically a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, its Chinese-sponsored infrastructure development there has only been limited and is highly controversial among the Filipino public. Despite China's attempts to make inroads, the United States and its respective companies remain the heaviest source of foreign investment in the Philippines. The situation has limited the Chinese government's ability to exert economic coercion over that country. In the past, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership could have hoped to buy at least the neutrality of the Philippines concerning the Taiwan issue, but with the new bases and both the military and economic ties that it brings with the United States, this possibility just got sharply reduced. The failure of China to bring the Philippines into its orbit, despite the 6 years of friendly Duterte presidency, severely threatens Beijing's plans for Taiwan. Geographically, the Philippines is just too important to the success or failure of an operation to take the island. The Philippines now actively coming onto the side of the United States makes the already difficult operation even more difficult for China, and the problem is only likely to get worse for Beijing. Unlike China, the Philippines is increasing in population. It is expected to increase from the current 117 million to about 180 million by the end of the century. Meanwhile, China's population peaked in about 2020 and is now declining. It is expected to shrink from 1.4 billion to about 776 million by the end of the century. The Philippines' economy is growing as well, with an average annual GDP growth of 6.4% since 1990. As the Philippines' population economy grows, it will be an even better source for American investment, and the new wealth will give the Philippines the opportunity to expand its military power in the future. Add this reality to China's economic and demographic problems, and the window for the mainland to reunify with the island through use of force might be closing rapidly. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was not happy about the renewal of the EDCA and the expansion of American military bases and financial investment in the Philippines. When the news came, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States and Philippines of increasing tension in the region and helping to destabilize it. For the Philippines, though, there is little choice but to strengthen its ties with the United States. As another country in the first island chain, it would be even more subjected to China's whims if it took control of Taiwan. Just like Japan, its airspace would be under threat if China controlled the skies over Taiwan. Its shipping and maritime commerce, already under stress from China's occupation of strategic real estate in the South China Sea, would be that much more inhibited. When seen in this light, it was probably foolish for the Chinese leadership to believe that the Philippines would ever come under its orbit to the extent that countries in the Eurasian interior would. In the affairs of nations, security considerations will almost always win out over economic considerations. Because of its geopolitical position, the Philippines cannot let China secure a hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific region, which it would do if Taiwan were to fall. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Philippines to forge ties with and host the military of the only nation that can prevent such a thing from happening, the United States. China may have thought time was on its side, but the renewal of the EDCA might just mean that by 2049, China will be unable to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, let alone actually succeed in its plan. But what do you think? Do the new American bases in the Philippines shift the region's balance of power and threaten China's plans to invade Taiwan? If so, how heavily? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.